my students come and they have masks on and we sit outside. I'm just being very cautious.
Yeah.
What about you there?
Yeah, here also. But now we are, we do use masks, but since this is on online seminar, so we have removed our masks, right? We are able to see.
No, they've been very
nowadays we are going to restaurants and all. With masks, yeah. The number of cases has reduced to a large extent. Yeah. Because
it's been very odd. But then again, it's sort of simplified your life, because I find that all of the moving around I was doing was really not necessary. The shopping, the eating out.
Oh yeah.
The superficial friends. I found ultimately I did not need a lot. I didn't need as much interaction as I thought. It's a very sort of odd.
Live streamed.
The number of cases has reduced. Okay. To a large extent. Yeah.
Because it's been very odd. But then again, it's sort of simplified your life, because I find that all of the moving around I was doing, I'm talking not necessary. The shopping, the eating out, the superficial friends. I found ultimately I did not need. Don't forget to do it. I didn't need as much interaction as I thought. I'm not going to dick around with that. I'll just be quiet. All right. That's when I'll screw up and disengage myself. I'm not going to. It's been very okay. So far so good. Unless it totally crashes, I'm going to call you. Okay. We'll talk after. Maybe we'll talk after it if you want to call me. Okay, sweetie. Okay, take care. Bye bye. The superficial friends. Huh. That was my student to find out if I was okay with the Zoom. So what happens now?
I think we'll be starting in 5 minutes. 10 o'clock, we'll begin our session. Yeah. In the meanwhile, if we have anything to do, yeah. I hope you had your food and all.
I have my water.
Okay, fine.
Because I noticed the speaker last night, she was thirsty. And I thought maybe I would be thirsty too.
Yes.
Welcome, Professor Ipshita.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Ipshita. How I can hear you.
Where are you?
I'm fine. Nice to hear your voice. Nice to see you.
I can't see you.
You can't see me.
No.
Oh. Do I have to start? Do I have to hit the video?
No, hang on. I'm viewing someone else's screen. So that's the reason why I can't see you. But you can see me. That's very interesting.
I can see
you. What's going on?
No, Dorothy has to switch on her
Hi.
video.
Hi, how are you?
I've switched it on.
Am I supposed to do the start video? No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Start video.
Oh,
Yes,
there I am.
fine.
Oh, good. Okay. I forgot to do that. All right.
Ah, there you are. I see you now.
Yeah.
What
I
time
miss
is
you.
it?
It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has. It's been.
It-
at
I
least-
just received the Italian book. It's out.
Hmm.
And you will be getting your copy in the mail, but I will send you tomorrow
Okay.
the digital copy.
Okay. That's great.
It looks good. John did the cover. It looks good. It was a long haul. As I said,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
now really, really appreciate working with my Indian colleagues after working with my Italian colleagues. Indian Standard Time is much better than Italian Standard Time.
You mean it's faster?
Yes,
It is? Good.
it's the Indians do things in a much more timely, reasonable fashion than the Italians.
Oh, that's very good to hear.
I mean, I now look forward to the next venture I do with any Indian colleague compared. The Italians are lovely, but they have a difference. They look at time in a different way.
Oh, that's right. Of course. I mean, that's the whole point, right? They do look at time in a different way.
And also the paperwork and the bureaucracy is much
Okay.
greater than anything I experienced in America or in India. I mean, the paperwork, the bureaucracy, it's quite astonishing. It makes you feel good about
Yeah,
You
it
thought-
makes me feel good about everything. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, really,
it's great to hear.
So
Wait a second. Right. Are we kind of close to starting? No, I think we are 1 minute away from starting. Yeah, right. Is that so?
Morning. Good
Hi,
morning.
Kokila, where are you? Yeah, I can hear you, but I can't see you.
she's there. There
I'm
she is.
there.
I don't know why I can't see it. I mean, I can see Dorothy and I can see Plenary 1.
Just move your
Ah.
screen, maybe you can see me.
Nene, I think it's got to be the way my screen is sort of organized. I think that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah, there you are. Yes.
now I just have a big U.
Also, I said hi.
Yeah.
Maybe we could-
Now I'm just seeing Ipshita.
Yeah, and there's Satish in the corner.
Oh,
At
hello,
least in
Satish.
my corner. I don't know where. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we're all set to go. So when you guys want to start,
Let's just start. Are you going to introduce me? Or not?
are we going to what or not?
Are you going to introduce me or not?
Yes, I'm going to
Oh.
introduce.
No, you don't have to.
But organizers will need to tell me when I'll do that.
Oh, okay.
Hmm.
Can we
We
begin?
have to. Oh, there's someone else.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this is Chandrika.
Mhm.
Okay, so I think we are ready to begin now. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chandrika Das, a PhD scholar from the Department of Translation Studies. I welcome each one of you to the second day of our online international seminar titled Translation as Reconstitution, Issues of Self, Canon, History and Memory in India. Let me take this opportunity to welcome Professor Dorothy Figuera, who has kindly agreed to be the speaker of our plenary session this morning. We will now play an audio-visual file which will introduce us to Professor Figuera and the immense contribution she has made to the field of translation studies.
Dr. Dorothy M Figuera is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Comparative Literature of University of Georgia. She has been a visiting professor at the University League, Jadavpur University, and Indira Gandhi Open University in New Delhi. She is an honorary president of the International Comparative Literature Association. In the past, she has also served on the boards of the American Comparative Literature Association and the Southern Comparative Literature Association. She has served as the editor of The Comparatist and is currently editor of Literary Research. Her research interests include religion and literature, translation theory, exoticism, myth theory, and travel narratives. Some of her notable works are Translating the Orient, The Exotic Decadent Quest, Aryans, Jews and Brahmins, Otherwise occupied theories and pedagogies of alterity. Some of her edited volumes include Cybernetic Ghosts, Theatres in the Round, Multi-Ethnic, Indigenous and Intertextual Dialogues in Drama. Apart from that, she has written numerous scholarly articles and presented many academic papers. For her research works, she was selected for Senior Research Fellowship by the American Institute of Indian Studies, bestowed with Distinguished Research Professor Award by the University of Georgia, and received Distinguished Scholar Award by Indiana University.
Thank you, Ramakrishnan. I also welcome amidst us Professor Ipshita Chanda, who has accepted our invitation to chair this plenary session. Professor Chanda teaches comparative literature at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. She used to teach at the Jadavpur University earlier. She translates between Bangla, Hindi, and English. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. Well, good morning, and thank you very much for this opportunity to see Dorothy virtually. And it is always a pleasure and a privilege to hear her speak. And there is another thing that I want to say before I hand it over to her. This is a very provocative conversation that has been going on for a while now between us. And the entire focus of Dorothy's work in the last many years has been to engage with holy cows and marginalize them in some way or the other. So that process continues. And she's going to be talking to us about how the West is still the world, even though we've been trying our best to refocus things. Dorothy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. And thank you for the opportunity of speaking to this august group. I'll just begin. Scholars have traditionally based their study of past cultures by mastering relevant languages and immersing themselves in key texts, because these texts were thought to have something important to reveal about the cultures and societies under study. This inherited sense of the humanist mission has given way to another paradigm in which humanists subscribing to ideological thought are animated by fidelity to hyper-explicative formulae which uncover the inadequacies of democratic Western institutions. Their mission is to interrogate, under duress if required, one's central texts and reveal their complicity in the sins, in various sins, capitalist, patriarchal, heteronormative, consumerist, of humanism. Based on such considerations, I would like today to investigate the origins, history, and practice of a series of ideologically inflected literary pedagogies currently practiced in the US and their impact in India, a site where translation studies and comparative literature flourish as disciplines. In the United States, the fate of comparative literature departments, their downsizing or absorption into other disciplinary structures, and the colonization of the world's literatures in translation by English departments under the institutional rubric of world literature calls to mind Walt Whitman and his poem, Salut au Monde. Although an eclectic reader and someone who did not travel beyond North America, Whitman evoked in this poem many places in the world through the optic of a rather mystically abstracted vision of an America, at once generalized and exceptional. It is a world that Whitman populated with undifferentiated others, facilely reduced to camarados. The critic Alfred Lopez has compared Whitman to the Cuban poet and translator Jose Marti, and has speculated on their possible encounter at a reception in Madison Square Garden in 1785, following a lecture by Abraham Lincoln. If Marti had encountered Whitman, they would have conversed in English, since Whitman was exclusively Anglophone, while Marti could have also conversed in Spanish or in French. Marti might have broached any number of interesting topics, since he was learned in the classics and had advanced degrees in law and philosophy, was a renowned journalist, editor, novelist, and playwright. In short, he had a considerably larger intellectual scope than Whitman. Yet one would not guess the US poet's limited expertise in a broad range of subjects and disciplines from his poetry, or its expansive and expansionist claims. Whitman had no problem with his parochial vision or his provincial experience of the world. One has only to think of starting from Paumanok, where he imagined himself, quote, sailing to other shores to annex yet welcome every new brother, end of quote, without stopping to wonder how he proposed to accomplish this encounter in English. One might even question how his prospective new brothers might feel about being welcomed in their own homeland by some interloper. Whitman's inverted logic of welcoming new brothers presents a crystallization of US exceptionalism that serves as an apt metaphor for what I see at work in US academia, and particularly in the recent pedagogical formulation of world literature. Marty's interdisciplinarity, his in-depth knowledge of other cultures and languages, and his awareness of cultural difference calls to mind comparative literature at its disciplinary best, while Whitman's claim to annex the world reflects world literature's project of unabashedly consuming the world translated into English, the new academic hegemonic language. As in the case of Whitman, there is considerable hubris involved when one purports to speak for the other. So too is the situation in a pedagogy such as world literature. Although it affects an engagement with respect of the other as a rarefied object of cultural difference, world literature only delivers a superficial and unidirectional overview, with Anglophone culture as the one recognizing the non-Anglophone and often non-white camarados. In order to be or to speak out, the non-white or the non-Anglophone culture must seek legitimacy and recognition from white or Anglophone culture and use its language to produce itself. The arguments I'm voicing here revisit analyses that I have previously advanced in publications where I argue that world literature and its appearance on the scene as a pedagogy does not merely betoken an assault upon comparative literature or attempt to replace it. The recent institutionalization of world literature also suggests an effort on the part of scholars to refashion themselves as monolingual globalists, now that certain recent theories and pedagogies of alterity have proven themselves to be bankrupt. The world literature scholar, whose formation has been almost exclusively in the English language and literature, proposes to reinvent the wheel. In other words, to claim to do what the comparatist has always done, but with a significant difference. World literature claims to be not elitist precisely because it does not require foreign language acquisition. But really, what is more elitist, provincial, or triumphalist than practicing a brand of criticism that claims to champion a voiceless and underrepresented world, but does so only in the English language translation and with Western critical paradigms? How can the imposition of English language translation and Western ways of thinking on the non-West make us non-elitist? There's a simple lesson one might learn here. Beware of academic initiatives that blithely claim to engage in a reform project. Just because standards of cultural and linguistic prowess have indeed eroded in the humanities, they have not disappeared. World literature's solution for fixing a perceived problem only confirms the hegemony of the English language, reinstalls the monolingual voice, and champions ideological concerns of Western theory. The world must be translated into English. Is this the policy to be implemented in the woke times in which we live? With the implementation of such a pedagogy, I really feel that we have come full circle back to Whitman. But there is a major difference. Whitman was able to indulge his fancies because he lived in an openly imperialistic age, in a country that reveled in its belief in white supremacy and gloried in an aura of rural utopianism. Our modern practitioners of world literature express their nativism and their sense of American exceptionalism in a much more subtle manner. And here, as in all scholarly justifications for shady political postures, from academic Marxism to the moral relativism of deconstruction, a theory is constructed to mask what's really taking place. In recent times, literary theory has relied considerably on postmodernist views of a hybridized and syncretic world. The work of Baudrillard has proven particularly influential in this regard, especially his notion that any part of the world can be recreated or made to stand for another. We live in a world of third-order simulacra, where encroaching pseudo-places merge to eliminate geographical or ethnic space entirely. Such a theoretical leveling out of the world has contributed to the metaphorical space in which critics can dwell that is separate from the real space that they inhabit. In this metaphorical space, critics can voice ideologies of subversion and rebellion that are simply too unsettling and hypocritical if voiced from their own actual lived space. Delicate balancing acts arise from the paradox of critics inhabiting a space of bourgeois comfort while needing at the same time to distance themselves from a space of global capitalism. When theorists appropriate the metaphorical space of the other, whether it be the American minority, the postcolonial, the exile, the queer, or here in India, the Dalit, they hope to exonerate themselves from all the benefits they receive from this same capitalism. In this process, we find the meeting of incommensurables, a 1960s need for the experience of political engagement, meeting a 1990s desire to be media savvy, and a more recent need to package and market intellectual capital. There is no small irony in how easily these conceptual frameworks meld. In US academic institutions today, the marketing concerns tend to be twofold. First, there's marketing to and through university administrators who buy into the idea that the study of the other, codified in various theoretical initiatives, is the most advanced approach to the miasma of the world's competing cultures and ethnicities. It is in this context world literature has become a rather clever gimmick that purports to enhance institutional inclusivity and claim to engage the literary production of the entire world, and do it exclusively in English translation. Then there is the individual agenda of administrators and instructional staff who, in translating the world, pretend to personally promote diversity. As noted, the conceptual roots of American branded world literature can be traced back to a series of pedagogical developments in the last 50 years. World literature can trace its origin to identity studies, which found its inspiration in Black studies and women's studies programs that came into existence in the 70s and were devised to represent the experience and cultural production of then underrepresented Blacks and women in academia. The addition to the curriculum of texts written by Blacks and women closely followed administrative efforts to diversify the faculty under the mandate of affirmative action. Over time, the recruitment of underrepresented groups expanded to include other minorities, such as Hispanics and Native Americans, and hyphenated ethnicities in the US, such as Asian Americans. These diversity initiatives, precursors to your Mandel Commission, coincided with attempts within the humanities to revamp the curriculum. These two separate events, diversifying the canon as well as the university community, resulted in the formation and implementation of a broad range of courses dealing with issues of identity that came to be popularly known as multiculturalism. From its inception, multiculturalism was institutionalized in the US as a bureaucratic structure purporting to foster minority rights. It claimed to re-envision the world from a decolonizing and anti-racist perspective. The next stage of the process of engaging the other extended beyond the US context. Here, postcolonial criticism emerged as a discipline by expanding inclusion to those populations that had been colonized. Postcolonial criticism claimed to offer a broad critique of the history of Western hegemony over its others by revealing the discourse that informed the West's assumption of cultural superiority. Just like identity studies and multiculturalism, it too claimed to offer a reading of previously unstudied texts and authors, as well as provide an oppositional examination of canonical authors and an alternate literary history. Also, like multiculturalism and identity studies, postcolonial criticism purported to focus on the lives and struggles of the oppressed and underrepresented masses. These pedagogies of alterity, as I've termed them, all took great pride in their alleged progressive agendas. However, essentialism soon beset discussions of postcolonial criticism. What could be included under its rubric quickly expanded to the degree that any society, it seemed, could be labeled postcolonial. The term postcolonial became so overdetermined so quickly that it was rendered meaningless. Postcolonial critics were often ignorant of key cultural signifiers present in the narratives they sought to deconstruct. Significantly, the postcolonial archive proved to be lamentably limited, a handful of endlessly recycled articles by a small group of theorists, and a discrete body of published texts almost exclusively in English. The practitioners of postcolonial criticism never really questioned that the language of empire did not really represent the totality of what could be termed the postcolonial experience. In all these efforts to give a voice to the supposedly voiceless, there was very little focus on gaining knowledge of indigenous languages. That would require the time-consuming cross-cultural linguistic work of a comparatist. Even under the conditions of controlled simplification, truly engaging the other would have required precise linguistic expression as the basis for thoughtful dialogue. But English texts or translations into English sufficed, since postcolonial criticism ordained that the globalized and colonized world should be studied in an English department. To scholars working in the literatures of these zones, the acontextual and fragmentary analyses of postcolonial criticism seem to exhibit a deep cynicism regarding the other as a fossilized object of clinical experimentation. But by now, cynicism was the order of the day. Just as multiculturalism could bring a field such as Native American studies onto campuses as a polite pseudo-intellectual vehicle to provide the appearance of ethnic diversity, so now the cultural production of Asia and Africa could be taught in translation in an English department without ever questioning the Euro-American, Amerocentric definitions of knowledge, validating the insights and conclusions of Euro-American academics. But as opposed to the potential investigation of non-Western literatures might undergo in the comparative literature context, with care given to their anthropological, religious, or historical context, as well as their languages, the projects of multiculturalism and postcolonial criticism offered no alternative to Eurocentrism and its institutions. If ethnic and foreign language authored texts were perceived as add-ons to white Anglophone structures, the centrality and dominance of the latter, or the institutional and structural determinants of inequality, were never addressed. In no way did these pedagogies problematize Amerocentric perspectives or definitions of knowledge. In their reconfiguration of the canon and inclusion of the other, they ultimately deliver nothing but stasis. Like multiculturalism and postcolonial criticism, reading the world's literatures in translation makes few demands. In fact, American branded world literature feeds into the same brand of American isolationism of which Whitman sang. The English professor trained in Western approaches teaches the vast literary production of the world. But this is not seen as a colonizing venture. According to David Damrosch, it's actually democratizing in its rejection of the linguistic elitism of comparative literature, where we aim to read texts in their original language. World literature is a particularly practical pedagogy, as Damrosch noted in a talk several years ago to Indian comparatists. For readers in a country such as India, he said, who, quote, have difficulty doing broad-based comparative study because they have long struggled against linguistic nationalisms and regionalisms, end of quote. This vision of India speaks volumes about world literature's and Damrosch's perception of the world. Under the guise of promoting diversity, American branded world literature seems to enable academic elites to displace, diffuse, and perhaps even intensify class, gender, and racial contradictions that are far from being resolved in academia today. Identity studies, multiculturalism, postcolonial criticism, and now world literature all tend to honor difference on a superficial level and implement a cooperative strategy of canon revision justified by an ethos of recognition. They seek to liberalize the canon by the addition of minority or non-Western literature. They promise to speak in terms of intervention and resistance, but they deliver nothing, even though cosseted academic armchair dissidents believe, as Ajay Ahmad has noted, that they are really involved in political action. The American Professional Organization of CompLit, the ACLA, was mildly aware of the underlying social and pedagogical concerns that linguistic demands made on the continued viability of the discipline. Already in the Levin Report of the Profession of 1965, suggested that peripheral languages might well be read in translation. Such a formulation, however, betrayed the unquestioned belief that English and the then popular European languages of French, German, and Italian would remain the central languages of the field. The next ACLA report, the Green Report of the Profession in 1975, repeated the need for knowledge of foreign languages as still fundamental to CompLit. The comparatists, who had been World War II refugees, were now succeeded by a new generation of polyglot comparatists fleeing the Eastern Bloc. So while the ability of non-immigrant American students to be multilingual was still an issue, it was not yet a full-blown crisis. Both the Levin Report and the Green Report lamented the language problem, but still mandated that US CompLit students study foreign literatures. Reading and translation was frowned upon. The Bernheimer Report of 1993 reiterated the problem of language proficiency and dependence on translation, but also highlighted for the first time that CompLit really needed to be progressive. That is, it really needed to be global in its perspective. The discipline's canon should reconceive, I quote, reconceive the canon or offer non-canonical readings of canonical texts. So if one cannot read those peripheral texts, and I think this means your Basha literatures, in the original, then at least one can approach them in a non-canonical way. We can avoid the failure of not acquiring underrepresented or even common languages, and we can ignore non-canonical literatures if we engage in a theoretical detour of reading in a non-canonical manner. In such a climate, with such issues plaguing CompLit with regard to foreign language acquisition, canonicity, and ever-present need for a progressive global perspective, is it any wonder that world literature appeared on the scene as an easy fix? Its chief advantages were its purported universal inclusivity and its total capitulation on the issue of linguistic proficiency. Its reliance on translations becomes inconsequential since the issue of translation has been given an entirely new slant. Whereas language proficiency problem had initially been interpreted in 1965 as a failure to bring American students up to the linguistic competency necessary to effect dialogue among cultures, it was now presented in quite different and quite positive terms. We should read the world in translation, and it's not at all limiting to do so. Nor is the reliance on English translations deemed imperialistic. In fact, reading the world's literary production in English translation is now promoted as a blow against elitism. The effects of this reformulation or the replacement of CompLit with WorldLit were negligible in first-tier institutions, as shown by the Saucy report of 2006. But it was understood that comparing the world's literatures in English translation in non-elite institutions was now legitimate. So now, vulnerable CompLit programs morphed into world literature. This rebranding was theoretically supported by the prognostications of Susan Bassnett and Gayatri Spivak, who both declared that CompLit had died, or by Damrosch, who felt that it was his mission to battle the elitism engendered by disciplinary demands for linguistic expertise. With WorldLit, so the logic goes, those at Harvard are not elitist, and those of us who are undereducated and not at Harvard can still study literature in a global perspective, exclusively in English translation. World literature's response to the dumbing down of the US curriculum in language acquisition is to universalize it. What CompLit saw as serious and respectful is now judged elitist and hegemonic. The foreign culture need not exist in its own right. It can now exist as a construct molded to suit undereducated students in first-tiered institutions, administrators in the corporate university, and large publishing conglomerates churning out world literature anthologies, and the consumer-savvy professoriate. The question then is the following: why in this age of globalization, when we are presumably engaging the world in a more informed manner and on its own terms, is the study of languages and their literatures being replaced by a pedagogy in which the literatures of the world are promoted in English translation? Why has an academic study of literature chosen to follow a Cold War political project of managing the other in the language of the hegemon? And why is this project not deemed hegemonic? Why should Comp Lit, a discipline focused on reading literatures in their own context and language, be replaced by such a pedagogy? What is really at work in this leveling out of the world's literary production and the linguistic triumphalism of the English language? Why are such projects of doing the other in translation not a cause for ethical concern? One reason is that the corporate university is not concerned with ethics. It is a business, and its monolingual administrators, often scientists, whose main task is budgetary oversight, immediately recognize the advantages of such co-optations. In the world of STEM research priorities, literature is not that important. It does not bring in grant money. If English departments can do English literature, why should they not handle other literatures as well, including the literatures of the whole world? With such a logic, there was really no reason to retain those boutique national language and Comp Lit programs, especially since English departments can now recruit scholars trained in English literature who are token representatives from post-colonial areas such as India in order to diversify their faculty. It is significant that the diversity thus engendered often involves elites from India and Africa, as well as American non-minorities who channel minority experience. Members of traditional American minority groups still remain grossly underrepresented in American universities. But this imbalance does not particularly matter, since the introduction of English literature trained scholars from post-colonial zones has provided the ideal solution to institutional racial politics. University administrators can now transform their often monochromatic campuses into something more colorful without having to confront the racism still operant in American universities or address the continued disenfranchisement of America's traditional minorities. Yes, faculties are racially enhanced by the presence of scholars from abroad, who inevitably stem from privileged segments of the population, where the study of English literature still carries a significant class marker. The problem here is not the increased hiring of immigrants, and certainly today, with the controversy surrounding anti-immigrant sentiments, I am not suggesting any such thing. As the daughter of a Guyanese immigrant and the mother of adopted Indian immigrant girls, I'm certainly not suggesting this. The problem centers on the discrepancies between the practices of hiring and retention. While administrative window dressing of institutional diversity initiatives have been quite effective, institutional racism and minority exclusion still remain operant concerns. With these pedagogies, the first world once again speaks for the other. Whites can channel the Black experience. Asian and African elites can perform as ventriloquists, speaking for those very populations whose oppression they may have ignored when back home. They serve as what used to be called native informants in the bad days of ethnology. They are now model minorities, displacing traditional American minorities and translating the non-West for easy consumption in the West. In all cases, monolingual Westerners and relatively privileged individuals from the rest are never forced to question their own classist, social, and professional trajectories. While they play act at being involved in a reform process, the situation is, however, problematic. When one considers that it started and continues to be implemented as traditional minority representation among students has plummeted and continues to plummet in US universities. the ideological project of proposing that the world can and should be read in English translation has largely succeeded in US universities. I then began to wonder whether this American brand of world literature, like so many other lousy American trends, has been successfully marketed abroad, or does its ideological and political focus limit its value exclusively to the American institutional setting? To assess its translation beyond our shores, I thought that I might look, in closing, at India, where comparative literature has historically been strong and still continues to flourish as a discipline. Has American world literature found traction here? As you all know, the Indian conceptualization of world literature, Vishwa Sahitya, was first articulated by Rabindranath Tagore's thoughts on the subject. Tagore tied Vishwa Sahitya to the individual's conception of the world and ability to inhabit and contemplate it. Vishwa Sahitya sought to develop an interest for the world beyond that accessible through colonial subjecthood. This conception led early Indian comparatists to look to European literatures and not focus exclusively on British literature. There have been many iterations of the spirit of what Tagore called Vishwa Sahitya in Indian comp lit over the years. But it seems that in India today, Vishwa Sahitya may very well adopt the American model, as evidenced by various world literature conferences, publications, and scholarly lectures where US academics perform their stardom. But I think there is room for hope, since Indian comp lit has not been slavish to outside influences. It has valiantly resisted attempts to dislodge the field from the curriculum and replace it with British cultural studies. Indian comp lit has even tried to shift the focus to intra-Indian comparison among the various bhashas. But the strength of English departments has largely smothered such initiatives. As in the States, English departments hold the greatest power in the humanities curriculum, and just as in the States, they have made a power grab by appropriating world literature and making it a fixture in English department syllabi, upon the recommendation of the UGC. There have also been attempts made at new universities to establish comp lit departments rather than traditional English departments, but such innovations have only met with limited success. If anything, India has imported identity studies more than world literature. This trend has particularly taken hold in the Indian universities, primarily in the form of Dalit studies. Just as with identity studies in the US, Dalit studies in India can also be wielded to undermine affirmative action. The haves of the world over tend not to want to give any advantages to any have-nots. As you know, Dalit studies came into existence in the aftermath of the Mandel Commission that allotted spots in universities for various scheduled castes. Just as minority status was extended in the US to groups far less discriminated against, such as white women and internationals, than traditional minorities, such as Native Americans, Blacks, and Hispanics, so too Indian non-scheduled castes have extended reservations. In the US, non-minorities falsely self-identify as minorities. The same is true in India. There are documented instances of non-Dalits having themselves temporarily adopted by Dalit families to claim eligibility for reservations. Non-Dalits have also appropriated Dalit studies. It is merely an extension of the manipulation of class and caste privilege. Casteism is even a concern in the United States, where Indian students have begun making complaints against caste discrimination among their fellow Indian students studying and working in the US, and against Indian professors employed there. There's also a problem of casteism embedded within the Indian student and cultural organizations based in American universities. Comp lit departments in India today work at a global level, theoretically and linguistically. However, they always exist in the shadow of the English department. As in the US, they're often combined as in English and comparative literature. In India, the emphasis is placed on acquiring knowledge of a foreign language such as French, Arabic, Spanish, Farsi, etc., along with emphasis on reading one's Indian mother tongue. But reading the mother tongue is a new phenomenon for students trained in English medium schools. Indian students, while comfortable in the bhashas, flock to comparative literature. They see it as a discipline that is more interesting and innovative than English literature. In comparative literature, they tend to compare some Indian literature, usually in their mother tongue, to the standard English department fare. Many Indian university students are trained in English medium schools, so their command of English is often better than that of their classmates who are trained in non-English medium schools. While Indian universities located in metropolitan areas have options such as the Alliance Française or the Max Muller-Bochum for acquisition of French and German, there are still very few centers for training in Indian languages. The modern Indian language department at Delhi University and the Center of Indian Language Department at JNU failed. The Bhasha scholars may be well equipped with intra-Indian language skills, but they can never compete with the dominant English departments. A Kannada speaker who knows Telugu and Tamil and a Telugu speaker who knows Bengali and Hindi do not realize their potential, while the English-speaking literature scholar who can barely engage with any other language comfortably participates in a world literature conference. If the English literature scholar located in a cosmopolitan space converses in English, the Bhasha scholar primarily speaks to a national audience, Kannada, Malayalam, Tamil, etc. The dream of developing a proper Indian comparative literature through the joint efforts of Bhasha literature scholars and Indian comparatists has not been realized. The study of English language literature as a class marker is so strong that it limits the development occurring in the near future, even in the present political climate. Yet there is some cause for optimism. It is certainly encouraging, for example, that in Part 2 of the National Education Policy of 2020, the policy details, quote, institutional restructuring, quote, and a more holistic education. The policy can be seen to acknowledge an underlying plurality to the concept of the nation, especially in its emphasis on areas such as the Bhashas, Bhasha literatures, and translation. This policy can also be seen in positive terms as decentralizing the hegemony of the English language departments and promoting the efforts of what my former student Satish Kumar elegantly refers to as the Sahridaya and the Sumanasa comparatist and translation studies scholar. So in India, it looks like world literature will not totally usurp the work we do reading texts in their original languages. If anything, India has adopted, in response to its own affirmative action initiatives, the American codification of identity studies rather than its formulation of world literature. It uses identity studies toward a similar end of co-opting the voices of its minorities, for which there are now reservations, and neutralizing them. In the US, the otherness of the world, studied without having to master any of the world's languages, absolves universities from having to hire traditional minorities. But, and I think this is significant, it also vitiates the need to continue to hire elites from countries like India, who in the past substituted for traditional American minorities as the preferred persons of color. Reading the world in translation as institutionalized in world literature has the potential for allowing institutions to dismiss the pressing and legitimate issues of racial discrimination in American universities. It also enables these same universities to retrench and take the university back from those others, like those Indian model minorities who have gained too much of a foothold. For this reason, both in the US and in India, we would do well to question the political agenda to which the pedagogy of reading the world in translation is being used. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. One of the things, of course, which adds to the pleasure of hearing Dorothy speak is the provocation that comes along with it. So I am expecting a whole barrage of questions, and without further ado, I think we will open the presentation up to questions.
I do not see anything except this ditch the 40-minute limit. So I'm a little concerned how to get out of that. Let me I'm afraid to click on this post attendee Zoom. Maybe oops. Are you still there?
You can just leave
You're
that be.
visible and audible. Yeah, sorry, Tarkeshwar, you were saying something.
I have nothing. Can you still hear me? I see nothing.
Absolutely, we can hear and see you.
Oh, I can't see anything. I see my email. So so I'm sorry.
No, I think you'll have to sort of get back again, but then you're perfectly visible and audible to us.
Oh, I see.
And there's a question already. So
okay.
What should we do?
I see you.
Tarkeshwar, Lakshmi, what should we do?
Okay, I'm okay.
You're all right? Fine. So yeah, we'll start with Nina. Nina has a question.
Ma'am, first, I would like to say it was a great honor to listen to your speech today. And definitely, as ma'am said, it was provocative. It raised certain issues and questions which may make us deeply uncomfortable with the way we teach, we study, and we do research in India, as well as when we look at the West for our theoretical moorings, which we cannot deny as yet. I just was wondering, because you asked a question that it would be good to explore whether how world literature, or this concept of pedagogy of world literature, is being established in India, or is it following the same pattern that it has in the United States? So I just had a query that when you explained how this concept of world literature and pedagogy of world literature established itself and promoted itself in the United States, when we apply the same idea to India and we try to explore what is happening in India, what role would the multilingualism and plurilingualism of India play, in the sense that an Indian student in an Indian university comes with an, let us say, socio-cultural baggage, which includes multilingualism and multiculturalism, which I would say is a little bit different from the United States, which, as you clearly explained, is dominated even today intellectually by a single language. So what role would that play when we set up the criteria or the parameters for researching how world literature has made inroads into Indian pedagogy? That is my question.
First of all, I guess my point I wanted to get across is I think India is very safe. Because of your the multilingualism of most of the population, we don't have this problem of deciding to hegemonically level out the world by reading it in English. I don't see that happening. What I do see happening is a flirtation. There's this new thing coming from America. It's called world literature. We'll have some conferences. We'll devote some things to it, but it's never really going to happen because of the multilingualism of India, as opposed to the monolingualism and the inability to teach languages here. What I think is interesting is that there's a flirtation with world literature, just like there's a flirtation with any number of fads. These silly fads that come from America. But what I really thought was interesting was you chose not to go, or there's no reason to go to world literature. What you found attractive, what seems to have traction, is identity studies in the form of Dalit studies. And that I think is rather interesting. Of course, we took a lot of our post-colonial criticism from you, or at least the more interesting post-colonial criticism we have. Multiculturalism is not something that you're very interested in. Of all these pedagogies, the one that seems to have grasped the attention of people has been identity studies. World literature, I think, will not have a very severe effect on India. I just wish that perhaps CompLit was able to build its intra-Indian comparison departments. That would truly be fantastic. So that's really the gist of my paper here, is that it's not, world literature has no meaning outside of America. It's basically an American problem of people not learning languages, and people who can't learn languages coming up with a way to take the power back from people who, in small departments where they know languages, or from from faculty that happen to arrive with multiple languages and make them feel bad about themselves. I mean, it's really quite the sort of power ploy one finds among English departments in most institutions. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Right. Do we have, I mean, I'm sure we have more questions. Right. Yeah. DTS-EFLU wants to ask a question, which is probably Tarkeshwar. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Dorothy, for that. As Ipshita said, provocative paper. I will begin with a clarification, a factual one. The Mandal Commission report did not allot seats for the scheduled caste. So the seats for the scheduled caste exist from 1950 once we accepted the constitution. And in some of the princely states in India, it existed much before that too.
Okay.
So Mandal Commission report allotted seats for the other backward castes, not the scheduled caste. And it was implemented in early 90s. So though it was recommended in 79. So this is one factual thing, but it doesn't take away anything from your argument.
No, thank you for that clarification. I need that. I didn't have that straight. I was much more. I was talking from my memory, not from any notes. That was a fault of mine. I appreciate you clearing that up. I was much more. I was spending too much time going through the policy document, which was daunting. But thank you very much for that clarification. I'll clean that up.
There are other two issues I think that are important that you raised, which we also discussed yesterday in the seminar, both in the morning session and also in the afternoon session. That was about the role of translation in making the canon. So yesterday there were discussions about how the making up the canon of Dalit literature in India through translation in English departments affects the canon that is already formed within the Indian language literature. There is a canon already here, and this translation now it affects the canon over there. So in that sense, the politics of canon through translation was discussed yesterday, and also the question of the concept of Indian writing in English translation, which is again becoming monolingual. When we have multiple literatures which are vibrant, picking up few texts and then creating a Indian literary canon was problematic. I think your paper also pitches the same question at a different level altogether, at the level of world literature and then in the American context. The issue of comparative literature in India is quite complex, I think, than the one in America, as Nina also pointed out. We see comparative literature being carried out in India in 3 locations. One is proper complete departments. And again, within the proper complete departments, we have Jadavpur model, Delhi model, and then Hyderabad model. That's a different issue. And then we also have comparative literature being carried out in proper English departments. And we also have comparative literature being carried out in, let's say, Institute of Kannada Studies, Institute of Tamil Studies. So the kind of comparative literature that is happening there, because for example, in Mysore University, in the Institute of Kannada Studies, we had a Malayalam faculty member, a Telugu faculty member, a Tamil faculty member, teaching language as well as literature to those students. So the kind of comparative literature that happens exclusively in Indian languages, not in English, that is never recognized as comparative literature at all. That is one point. So when we talk about comparative literature in India, we need to see these 3 locations where the comparative literature research is taking place and what is happening there. And then the third point I thought in your presentation is that about the literature, so the relationship between comparative literature and translation studies. Though you did not put it in those terms, what I could glean from that is that comparative literature always thought translation studies is part of it in terms of the reception studies. Though they did the comparison of text in the original languages. Lately, we have seen relying on translated literature. I will not get into the politics of it because we've explained it. But I would say that the translation into English and relying on the translation on English has its problems. But at the same time, accepting the issues that you have flagged in your talk, it is also democratic, especially in the context of India too. So English cannot be kept aside easily here because there are languages which are ready to occupy the place of India, occupy the place of English in India. So in order to keep those languages away, there are departments and groups which try to accept English rather than Hindi. So it complicates the scenario in India. And then the relationship between translation studies and comparative literature. I'm not over-enthusiastic to dismiss comparative literature as part of translation studies now, as scholars have done. But even today, I have seen comparative literature scholars dismissing translation studies. Why are you doing comparative literature? You should limit yourselves to discussing translation and problems of translation, not getting to the thematic studies. But I would argue that with linguistic expertise being here now and comparative literature departments being more monolingual and doing thematic study in translation, based on translation, so the translation studies people are more equipped to do comparative studies because they know the language of more than one language. So what should be the relationship between translation studies and comparative literature in this changed context is something that we need to sit and discuss properly. Otherwise, translation studies get dismissed, or translation studies will start dismissing comparative literature.
If I might answer, answer your questions, let me start with the first one, referring to the canon. And here I'd like to go back to the issue of how translation does form the canon. And this, I remember talking to an Estonian colleague of mine who was a poet, and he said that, you know, this is a problem. If the literatures of the world are going to be in a world literature anthology, Estonian literature will never enter into it because Estonian literature is poetry and it's epic poetry. And how are you going to put any part of an epic Estonian poem in a world literature anthology? So therefore, Estonian literature never will appear in any world literature anthology. Estonian literature disappears. And I thought that was really important. It has to do with a genre. It has to do with so many issues, what gets anthologized in these anthologies. So that's, so you're right, there is this real issue of canon formation if one is depending to, entirely on translation. Secondly, your comments about the 3 locations. We too have the 3 locations. We have complet as it's done in an English department. It's not what some of us consider to be complet, trained comparatists. It has to do oftentimes with just the reading continental theory in translation in fragmentary form. We have complet also in our foreign language department. So if Romance language department would do something maybe comparative, but once again, it's not what we comparatists might think is comparative literature. So we do have those 3 locations also in America. I think your third question is very interesting. World translation studies does not have the profile. It's just not that popular. There are a handful of translation studies programs in America. Translation studies, if it's taught at all, is taught in complet. And the level of the discussion is not very interesting. We haven't really, we're not really doing translation studies to the degree that translation studies is done absolutely everywhere else. And I think that's rather interesting. There's the Binghamton program in translation studies. There's Texas with Austin, where they had strong translation studies. But if you want to do translation studies, you go to those 2 places, you don't go anywhere else. So translation studies has not taken off. And I don't know the reasons for that. I'm not that familiar with it. And so whatever is done in translation studies is done poorly or well in a conflict program. And once those conflict programs die, they're not going to, there's going to be no place for translation studies. I think that's responding to your 3 points.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
think we had, Ajay, right.
Hello, ma'am, Figuera. Am I
Yes.
audible?
Yes.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, and I want to tell you something. I have read your book, which I have written recently, Comparative Literature. Where have we been? Where are we now? Where we are going? And do we want to go there? I really enjoyed that small booklet. And my question is, since your talk is titled, "The World is Still the West," and as you are aware that Spivak has written in Crossing Borders that we should cross the borders and embrace the area studies to comparative literatures and embrace the languages of Southern Hemisphere. But do you think that did we cross the borders, or what we should do more to cross the borders? Actually, by seeing your title, it seems that we really didn't cross the borders. That's why you are saying the world is still the West. So what do you think?
I'm just deeply offended. First of all, I'm deeply offended by those theorists who talk about the fact that comparatists have never been truly comparative or global in their focus. I know a lot of comparatists are Asianists and Africanists, and because a bunch of comparatists don't know non-Western languages, they assume that everyone doesn't know non-Western languages, and so this notion that we have there haven't been people trying to study the peripheral languages or the ultra minor languages, as they're called, is really quite bogus. I mean, maybe some of the attempts have not been fantastic, as Etienne in Paris's ideas of these keeps of these groups of people trying to do multiple languages. But nevertheless, there has been this attempt of engaging in a real way with other cultures. So to say that this hasn't been happening, I think is a red herring of sorts. And to replace that with this notion of, yeah, it's okay to just translate things and somehow this is politically responsible, I just find very unpleasant. I find this retrenchment. I really see, and maybe this is because I'm in the South, I really see this taking back of the university, taking back of the universities from the minorities who've come in, taking back of the university from some women, taking back of the universities from these foreigners who've come in and no one wants to have around anymore. And, and it goes back to the old power structure, but with the difference that the power structure now claims to be progressive. I mean, I'm getting to that stage in my life where I'm looking at things and I'm saying, are things any less racist than they were 60 years ago in America? And I sort of see these, I'm sorry, I'm very personal about this. I see these pedagogies as a scam. I see them as pretending to take the world seriously at the same time that the campuses become whiter and whiter than they were when I was a student, except with a couple of people who come from India. It's a very problematic situation. Indians are not African Americans. However, administrators think, I can tell you, I took out the section in my paper, I can tell you what the average administrator thinks about race. When I came to, I'll give you one story. When I came to Georgia, I looked at the demographic of Georgia. I was running the department, and I saw that there were a lot of Vietnamese in Georgia, and there were a lot of Indians in Georgia. So I went to the scientist dean, and I said, we have to start teaching Vietnamese and Hindi. And he turned to me and says, will you teach Hindu? And I said, I cannot teach Hindi because I don't have a degree in Hindi. He says, but you can teach Hindu. And I said, I don't think the Indian community wants me to teach Hindi. We just went back and forth 10 times. And finally he says, yeah, you can teach Hindi because you look like one of them. And I said, okay, if that's the criteria. It was summer. I was one of them. So, I mean, this is the situation. And so when I see these pedagogies of the other, my antenna go up, quite simply. My antenna go up. And I'm really seeing this world literature as we don't need these others anymore here. We can do the other without the others. And I do think that might be an issue here. We'll have a couple of our native informants. We'll have our representatives, model minorities from India or Africa, but basically we're taking the world back. White America's taking the world back. Okay, and we're doing it in an English department, which is not known for its diversity. So,
yeah. Thank you. Since the rupee just fell further against the dollar, I think you're doing a good job and you're welcome to it. Do we have time for other questions? Because we do have one more question.
We have 10 more minutes.
We have 10 more minutes. Okay, then, Satish.
So this is an extension of the what you were just saying. I mean, when we think of a pedagogy for alterity, it's undeniably rooted in a desire for the other, which more often than not is, again, located within a crisis of selfhood. And here I'm going back to your work in the exotic, or more recently in the hermeneutics of suspicion, and your more recent work on the Bhagavad Gita and its receptions in Europe and America. So I was wondering if you could speak a little more specifically on how one locates this desire, especially for the non-immigrant other, and how it manifests in practices of world lit today, and what are the ethical underpinnings of such desires and how they manifest?
Thank you for the question, Satish. I think I sort of basically did sort of suggest this. I think there's a power struggle here. There is a downsizing of the university. There is, of course, we know the destruction of the professoriate. There are no more professors. There's only now a peon class of lecturers, people with PhDs and publications who teach 3 times what a professor used to teach for 1/3 of the salary. So there is this destruction of what used to be the university. And this general sort of humanities don't matter. Certainly a language department doesn't matter. Why would you teach? The example would be, why would you somewhere in the Midwest teach Tamil in Wisconsin to 3 students when you can teach Jhumpa Lahiri to 450? And this is what's happened. You're looking at the deans, and maybe someone doesn't think that maybe it's important that a group of American students might learn Tamil or Telugu in 1 or 2 universities in America. No, 3 students learning Tamil or Telugu is not important. 400 bodies in that class on Jhumpa Lahiri is what's important. And so therefore, India becomes Jhumpa Lahiri. Not that I have no problem with Jhumpa Lahiri, but this is what it is. It's this profit-based corporate university. And with the retrenchment, there is the, who are going to be the people in those few jobs? Are the people in those few jobs going to be an immigrant from India? Or is that person going to be a white American? I think the university is in crisis. The university is disappearing. It's disappearing at a very quick rate. What's happening in terms of pedagogy, in terms of standards are plummeting. What can you expect in terms of pedagogy with that situation?
Yeah.
I don't want to get into the anecdotal, but I may be moving to another department because my department is sort of falling apart. I went to the dean and I pointed this out, and I said, you can send me to classes because I have a graduate degree in classics from the Sorbonne. you can send me to the religion department because I have a graduate degree in religion from Harvard. You can send me, and he says, well, no, maybe, and his suggestion was I go to African American studies. And I said, well, one, I've never studied African American studies. Two, I've never taken an English class in my life. Three, don't you think there's something problematic about that? And it goes back to the you can teach Hindu. I mean, it's this notion that we have this body, we'll put this body someplace until this body retires or dies. And if people go to an African American studies class, then they'll see a professor who knows nothing about African American studies. And I thought to myself, well, this would make a very nice article, how a fourth-rate Sanskritist ends her career as an African American studies professor. And I thought, well, this is where the American university is now. I knew I was a fourth-rate Sanskritist. That I've never pretended to be anything but a fourth-rate Sanskritist. But I never thought that I'd end my career teaching Harry Potter in an English department, which is another option I was given, or teaching African American literature, which I really know nothing about. So everything's falling apart. So now we have pedagogies that are matching the disintegration of the university. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Satish, or not.
And this is markedly different from, say, like, you know, the Germans translating the Bhagavad Gita because they're trying to find themselves, or the American transcendentalists engaging with some sort of mysticism because, again, they're trying to find themselves. So now are we reaching out to the other for, I mean, what are we reaching out to the other for then?
We're reaching out to the other to show our own bona fides as being politically progressive. The other is important for me to study, not because I'm curious about the other, not because I feel a lack within myself, not because it's important to engage with something different than myself, but rather this gives me a certain political cachet that I otherwise don't have. So I'll teach the other that because that somehow compensates for my otherwise existence that doesn't show that I give a damn about anyone. And so it becomes a very personal, solipsistic performance. It's performance art. That's, I think, so much of what we do is performance art.
Yeah, I mean, there's good news for you on one front, in the sense that the University Grants Commission has just introduced something called Hindu Studies in the net. So I'm sure you'll be very welcome in some of these departments which are going to now teach Hindu studies, whatever that is. But I mean, specifically on the question of why are we at all interested in the other? I mean, by we mean, of course, the American academia. As
Satish pointed out, the other used to have a really important thing. The British said, I mean, Wilkins says in his translation, let's understand what these people are doing because we're ruling them, and we will rule them better if we know what the hell they're talking about.
But my question was that if that is the question, I mean, if that's the reason why, you know, we want to kind of highlight our bona fides to the other, then what is the ethics of translation there?
No, we're not. Our bona fides are not toward the other. We don't care what the other thinks
about us. Okay,
then
my question remains, however.
We care about what people from our own class, our own group
in which
think.
case, why translate at all? Is there any reason to translate?
Is there any reason to translate? I think the people who are interested in the other are the people who are translating. The people who are not translating are reading the translations in English. The people who translate do care, in my estimation. They are interested. It's the people who are institutionalizing reading the world in translation who are the ones that don't care or care less. I do think the people who do translate, I mean, as I said, there are aesthetic reasons, there are religious reasons, there are cultural reasons. The Germans were translating because they needed to build their own national literature. You needed Goethe and Schiller needed to have Kalidasa as a model to come up with a German poetry. Some people do because they have a lack in themselves. They feel they need to learn from the other. Some people do out of a sense of hospitality, as Ricoeur would say. Some people do to control why people translate. I think when you translate now, I think these are the people who sort of still believe in engagement. The people who translate now believe in engagement, but that's a far step from the person who says, okay, the world is real in this form, and we need not think about translation. My problem is the world literature people are not thinking about the issue of translation. They're just giving us it in English, and that should suffice. And that's the cynicism I was talking about. But I have I have highest estimation for the highest esteem for people who translate. I mean, it's a noble task. You're doing God's work. In my estimation, the translators are doing God's work. But I think when we read a translation, we should realize it's a translation, and there's some other questions to maybe ask.
I think that is a positive note to end on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
May I request you, ma'am, now to give your closing remarks?
Sorry?
Ipshita, ma'am, may I please request you to give your closing remarks?
I couldn't hear you, Chandrika. I'm sorry.
May I please request you to please give your closing remarks?
Oh, I was supposed to be giving closing remarks.
Oh, I think you gave them.
Actually.
Chair.
Okay. I really don't take these things very formally at all. And as I said, this is a conversation that we have been having for a long time. And this is just another stage in that conversation. It is very true. The only thing that I can say is that the position of the discipline of comparative literature and translation studies and their relation between them is a very specific and a singular one. It depends on what you think is comparative literature. On that depends where you place translation, which is a different ballgame altogether from translation studies.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a fundamental thing which I think the comparative literature department, at least in this university, has the responsibility of conveying, because we have with us a very vibrant and a very engaging and a collegial department of translation studies too. So it was a great pleasure to have you come into this conversation, but I think it is a conversation that will continue with or without you between comparative literature as a discipline, at least at EFLU, and translation studies, also a discipline at EFLU. We are very closely connected, and we have very deep difficulties which, because we are closely connected, it is possible for us to solve. For example, there are many things I could say regarding all that Tarkeshwar said, but that is for another forum altogether. I think at this point, it is specifically important to underline the fact that the conception of comparative literature in anywhere in the West and the conception of comparative literature anywhere in India, despite all the models that he was talking about, which are really not central to the practice of comparative literature in India at all. In fact, our engagement with translation studies is more central because it highlights the ideas of reception and hospitality, as you said, and it also highlights the ethics of engaging with the other, which I think should be the central concern of comparative literature anywhere. It is another matter that the West has other ideas and they are welcome to have them. But I can say for comparative literature in India, which I have been engaged with for the last 30 years, that is not on our agenda at all. As far as we are concerned, our focus is, in fact, plurality and the engagement with the other and the ethics of that engagement, the ethics of engagement with difference, in which I'm very privileged and proud to say that the Translation Studies Department is with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for making this session a truly engaging one. We will be beginning with the first session of the day in a little while. I now request Arsha to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Ipshita. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you.
Shall we start?
Yes, Asha.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the day 2 of the online international seminar titled Translation as Reconstitution, Issues of Self, Canon, History and Memory in India. I'm Asha. I'm currently pursuing my PhD in the Department of Translation Studies. This session is chaired by Dr. Amit Kumar PV. Dr. Amit Kumar is a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and India Studies at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. He completed his PhD from IIT Bombay and has also spent time as a Fulbright visiting fellow at Portland State University, Oregon, USA. He has published numerous research articles in various international journals. He has also presented papers at international conferences held in countries such as Denmark, Finland, Greece, USA, and UK. And he has delivered several keynote addresses at national conferences in India. His areas of interest include Bakhtin studies, comparative literature studies, translation studies, and disability studies. Welcome to the session, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Arsha, for a wonderful introduction. I hope I'm audible.
Sir, yeah, you are audible, sir. Today,
okay.
Sir, we have 4 presentations today, each of 20 minutes. The presenters will answer the questions at the end of the session.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So
hope you all
I
have a good day. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a pleasure to be a part of this wonderful international seminar organized by the Translation Studies Department. The session is titled Comparative Literature and Translation Studies and Poetry Translation. So what is very interesting about it is it focuses only on the poetry aspect. And we have 4 presenters here. I just request them to let me know whether they are present here. One is Asit Kumar Biswal. Asit, are you here?
Yes, sir, I'm present.
Yes. Then we have Ajay Varma, Alluri. Ajay, are you here?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Very much. Fine. So we have Nimish K. Sharma. Are you here, Nimish?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks.
Here, very much. So we have Amir Bashir. So do we have Amir Bashir also?
Yes, yes, sir, I'm present.
Very much. So fine. Thank you very much, all the 4 of you. I wish you all the very best for your presentations. Let me just begin with a very brief introduction to the presenters. Asit Kumar Biswal is an independent researcher. He was a student with the Department of Comparative Literature, and we know him very well. He was an ex-student of our department, and we are very happy to have you, Asit, and I'm sure you will be able to do a very good presentation. Next is a very brief introduction. Ajay Varma Alluri is a student of MA 4th semester at Center for Comparative Literature at the Humanities, School of Humanities at the University of Hyderabad. So wonderful to have you, Ajay. I wish you all the best for your presentation. And we have Nimish K. Sharma, student from Delhi University. So welcome, Nimish, too. And we have Mr. Amir Bashir, research scholar, Malwanchal University, Indore. So this is a kind of a brief introduction to all the 4 presenters. We will now begin with the presentation. Let me just request Asit to go first. So as you heard, you will get 20 minutes for presentation, and immediately after the presentation, we'll go to the next presentation and the 3rd and the 4th. And collectively, we will then have discussions and questions. So that's the way it is. So thank you very much. And I request Asit to just begin with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
You are. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be presenting a paper in this seminar. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Let me just share my screen.
Yeah, you can share. You can share.
Is it visible?
It is. Yeah, it is. It is. It is visible.
Okay, thank you. So the title of my presentation is Literary Translation from Below, Translation of Indian Literature from a Comparative Perspective. In the previous session, we had Professor Figuera talking about how translation into English can often be reductive, especially in Western locations. And then Professor Ipshita talking about the relation between comparative literature and translation studies. So I would be also raising some of those issues here. In this paper, I attempt to adapt Amyadev's idea of from below as articulated in his essays Comparative Literature from Below and Literary Translation from Below to the practice of literary translation, especially translation of Indian literature, and also discuss a few concepts that I think are essential to the discipline of comparative literature as well as to the practice of translation and thinking about this idea of literary translation from below. Translation is a crucial literary transaction that takes place between two literary cultures. For the discipline of comparative literature, translation is a very useful way of understanding cross-cultural encounters, since in translation, we can see or trace the approach the self has towards another culture, towards the difference embodied in the other. Translation not only is a result of contact between two literary systems and cultures, but also becomes the medium for further facilitating the contact between different literatures. It is also important for literary studies because the activity of translation entails all three practices indispensable for the being of literature, that is reading, writing, and interpretation. To translate, the translator has to read the source language text and come to its meaning through interpretation, and then represent, and I mean represent literally, that is present again, that meaning in another language ethically, which results in the translated text. There is no overarching rules or definitive theory for translation, and if we had a theory, that would be what can be called an from above approach, which I will presently discuss. Each literary text is singular, and there can be no theory or strategy that can encompass a foolproof way of translating every text. However, that does not mean that anything goes in the name of translation. Translation is an act carried out by the translation and the translator, and the translator has to make a number of choices for the translated text to come into being. These choices are the results of the translator's position regarding the various aspects of translation. That is why translation is political. The translator has to take a stand and articulate his choices on paper. The translator acts as the mediator between two cultures. Literary translation from below, I argue, that must take into account principles which concern with the internal singularity and the external plurality of literatures, and are based on certain ideas of otherness, difference, plurality, and ethics. Since difference and singularity are the essential elements of this approach, I submit that it cannot be homogenized. In this paper, when I talk about translation, I am only talking about literary translation, and I am concerned with translation as an act, a practice, and not as a system or a concept. Generally, when translation is talked about, it is seen as a linguistic or anthropological enterprise, but I am looking at it from an experiential point of view. That is how we actually practice translation and how translation can provide us a philosophy to live with cultural difference. Translation obviously happens in language, and one views of language come into play while translating. Translation is an act of willing engagement with the other. It is one of the ways in which transactions happen between two cultures and two literary systems. It also provides complete with a fixed way of understanding literary reception, because we can trace the choices that have gone into making of the translated text. The task of the translator is to preserve meaning, and as Syed Abdul Said writes, translation involves decisions with regard to meaning, since the task of translation is to preserve meaning. In as much as translation moves from word to meaning in the source language and from meaning to word in the target language, the translator has to confront the question of meaning twice from opposite directions. Unquote. The translator has to interpret the source language text and arrive at a meaning through their interpretation. This is where the agency and the ethics of the translator comes in. Now, before we discuss the idea of literary translation from below, I would like to point out an exercise in translation which I did. It is a translation of Against poem जो पुल बनाएंगे in Hindi. जो पुल बनाएंगे वे अनिवार्यता पीछे रह जाएंगे, सेनाएं हो जाएंगी पार, मारे जाएंगे रावण, जय होंगे राम, जो निर्माता रहे इतिहास में बंदर कहलाएंगे. The translation is those who will build bridges. Those who will build bridges, they certainly will be left behind. Armies will go across, Ravans will be killed, Rams will emerge victorious. Those who are builders in Itihasas, they will be called monkeys. So this poem presents a very perceptive observation about the class divisions in society using characters and images from the Ramayana. The poem points out how the working class people exploiting whose labor social progress happens are ignoring historical narratives of progress. And as you can see, I have left the word Itihasa untranslated, and the reasons behind it I will come to presently. The primary reason is the incommensurability between the idea of Itihasas in Indian literatures and the idea of history in English. So the idea of literary translation from below, in this I try to adapt or apply Amyadev's idea from below, which he has articulated for comparative literature and literary historiography. In that he points out that method comes from two words, meta and hodos, meaning moving after a way. And he says, if we have to arrive at a method, it must have begun by moving wayward for a while. So what is generally consecrated as a method, it's probably more of convention than anything else. So he argues that the application of a fixed method is violence to data, and this is an approach from above. So what happens in an above approach is that a theory or a fixed method comes first, and then the literary text or the data is put under it, and the aspects that do not fit are ignored. So if you apply this idea to translation, what you can see with theoretical approaches to translation like post-colonial, feminist, post-structural et al. Follow an above approach. They try to fix the way of interpreting the text and approach it only with the given areas of interest, and then they ignore whatever difference that does not fit. I try to argue that that is an unethical approach, and what we should try to do with translation is follow and below approach, which focuses on the primacy of literature, in which the method comes after and the text comes first. The text comes first and provides the context for the translation. And I'm not saying that a translation cannot be post-colonial or feminist or post-structural. A translation can be all these things if the original text is so, and not because of the ideological inclination of the translator. What we have to do is listen to the questions that the text raises instead of making it answer our own questions. So the approach of literary translation from below is never fixed or predicated. There is a recreation of the translation approach every time there is fresh data, which is virtually every time in literary translation. So Amyadev says that complete from above is a betrayal of Indian multiliterariness or multiliterariness or plurality, and complete from below is the antidote. So similarly, literary translation from below is essential if you want to preserve the plurality of Indian literatures in translation, especially in European languages like English. If we are talking about translation within Indian languages, then it's slightly easier because they already have the report to us for maintaining the plurality. He says structure is not its only program, and we should not be swayed by preoccupations at all. So we should not have any preconceived theory in our mind on how to translate. Ideology must not rationalize history, and if there is a conflict between ideology and history, it is ideology that must go. So if we apply that idea to translation, what happens is, if we have a prefixed ideology and that text does not fit, we must alter the ideology and not unethically chop the text to fit into our ideology. Literary history, and by extension literary translation, is a continuous dialogic of the predictable and the unpredictable, and we must always be open towards that unpredictable, towards that irreducible difference that the text presents to us. Literary history from below is a centripetal historiography where emphasis is not on the neatness of the design but on the inclusiveness of the material. So what we should be concerned with is in translation is how much of the interpretive possibilities of the original can be preserved instead of trying to follow a neat theory. It rules out all tendencies towards closure and fosters utmost openness. By openness, I mean here an openness towards the other. And I argue that literary translation from below is suitable to preserve the plurality which marks Indian languages and literature produced in these languages in translation. So now if we look at translation, translation is the translation of a language use. And if we are building from below, we must have certain conceptual tools on which to build our approach on. And these I will be discussing some of these. First is the view of language. The view of language I have adhered to while translating is the experiential or phenomenological view of language and not the linguistic or structural view. The structural view sees language as the system of rules, but what we translate is language use. Language comes to bring in its usage. As Merleau-Ponty points out, the experiential view is not an attempt to fix existing languages into a framework of all possible languages, but as a return to the speaking subject, to my contact with the language I am speaking, unquote. Language is what the subject speaks in a context. Language use is not a matter of linguistic ideas, but is characterized more by use value. When you translate is a particular use of language, that is literary use and not the rules of language or individual words. If we look at India as a sociolinguistic area, it is marked by an organic plurality. As Lakshman Puchanand points out, it is a situation that can be found in all Indian languages, boundaries between whom are extremely porous and fuzzy, making the sharing of several words and ideas a very common phenomenon. Almost all Indians are multilingual, and there is a significant degree of mutual intelligibility between neighboring languages. The People's Linguistic Survey of India has pointed that 790 living languages are there in the country at present, and each is a unique worldview, and that worldview is what literature presents to us, and we must try to preserve it. One recalls Khusro's share from his ghazal, Jehale miskin makon tagaful duraya naina banaye batya, kitabe hijra nadara meja, nalehu kahe lagaye chatya, in which we see that the odd lines are in Persian and the even lines are in Hindi, and that presents a case of plurality in our literature from a long time ago. We can also recall Kalidas and Kabir and many more in this context. If you look at plurality in Indian literature itself is not a fixed or determined entity, but as an ongoing and interliterary process, as Amir has pointed out. So if we are building an approach from below, we must take into account this. Indian literature is a plural category that takes into account not only the interrelations between literatures written in different Indian languages, but also their differences as well, both of which are the organic outcome of a historical literal process, is spatio-temporal unit of which is inhabited by more than one culture. Literatures are different, Indian languages are distinct but not isolated entities. They are, as Ipsita Chanda points out, individual entities formed from a plural base and part of a plural system. That is also the case of inherited text like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, one of which provides the context for Ajay's poems, which Shishir Kumar Das has called inherited texts. And that is the case of the common classical traditions. Indian poetic systems derived from Sanskrit, Tamil, Pali, Prakrit, and also from other literary systems like the European literary tradition and West Asian poetic systems like the Perso-Arabic poetic system, which have come to us through contact. One is reminded of Ghalib's share in this regard, where he says, "Hungarmi nashaate tasavvur se nagma sanj, main andalibe gulshan na afrida hu," in which only three words, "main" and "hu" and another "hu," make it a share in Urdu, whereas the rest of it, even the construction and the vocabulary, is fully Persian. So again, we see plurality in practice. And when we try to translate it into a non-Indian language like English, there is a possibility of failure, because English probably does not have the plural possibilities of representing such diverse language usage. Sometimes for translators too, one can think of Spivak's translation of Mahasuda Devi's Choti Munda and his Arrow, in which the translates the multiple languages in that text into quote-unquote standard English and the English spoken by the African Americans. So I would say that such an attempt is unethical, since it tries to reduce the plurality of the text into two variants of English. In translation, we engage with another language, another text, another culture. The other is another because it embodies an irreducible difference from the self. In this encounter, we might be inclined to reduce the other and its difference to our own terms and to objectify the other. Such an approach would be hegemonic and unethical. We have to remember that the other is a self like myself, like Merleau-Ponty points out. We have to remember that the other is also a subject and should be treated as such. We can have an I-it or an I-thou relationship with the other, as Beaver has theorized. The latter grants subjectivity to the other while the former denies it. So the I-thou relationship is an ethical position which we can take while engaging with the other. Literal translation from below must take this position. We can try to reach and understand the other through language, and translation is one such act whose medium is language. Now we come to the ethics of translation. By ethics, I mean what is proper to a time, place, or a cultural context. And in the case of literary translation from below, it is the context that is provided by the original text itself. While translating, one has to make proper choices that are appropriate to the context of the literary text, so that the difference that is part of the text is not erased or domesticated or foreignized. The difference has to be preserved properly. And one of the strategies is to ethically mediate untranslatable expressions by keeping them untranslated. This can sometimes result in untranslatability and incommensurability. So generally these ideas are seen as hindrances to the process of translation, but if we can look at them more openly, we can conceptualize them as the difference that is characterized by the other and be open towards it and include that in our translation strategy. Syed Abdul Said writes, translatability is a complex affair where you cannot directly seek equivalence. The reason being that concepts would be deeply embedded in the complex theoretical structure that comprises these levels. Any assertion would make sense only with reference to the theoretical structures of which it is an integral part. To put it in slightly different terms, the truth of assertion in such cases will not be a matter of simple isolated correspondence, but a matter of theoretical mediation. And I argue that literary translation from below is such a ethical and practical mediation. Words in a language carry with them a cultural significance when used in a context, and there is a need for an ethical mediation on the part of the translator to carry out this difference across in translation. We have to actively engage with this difference as translators, since translation is a domain in which sensitivity, I quote Said again, to the incommensurability arising from difference of situatedness or embodiment in the world is of enormous importance. We cannot achieve much harmony in the world just by pretending to celebrate difference unless we are alert to the implications of the difference and develop discursive tools to engage with them, unquote. To sum up, translation is an act that consists of an willing encounter or engagement with otherness and difference, which is followed by the ethical representation of the difference in another language. Literary translation from below is built on this ethics of encounter and is apt for the translation of Indian literature and literature in general. So now if we recall the Ajay poem, I chose to keep Itihasas untranslated because Itihasas in Indian literary system does not only mean history as it is used in many modern Indian languages. It is the term for history in several of the languages, as we know. But Itihasas also is a genre name in which it is a long text with certain pedagogic imperatives, and some tend to teach dharma and all. And it is said that the author is recording the events that happened in his lifetime, as opposed to the Purana, in which the events are happened in distant past. So Ramayana and Mahabharata are two of the Itihasa text, and they are part of the inherited text as well. And since the poem talks about an event, a context from the Ramayana, I thought it apt to preserve Itihas untranslated so that it reflects the plurality that we have discussed. There are a few more poems, but I think I have about a minute left. So I would like to end by reading a poem by Kuan Narayan, which in translation and as an ode to translation and plurality and in celebration of them. It is called Ek Ajib Se Mushkil by Kuan Narayan. I have a strange problem these days. The power to passionately hate is ebbing away day by day. I want to hate the English who ruled over us for 2 centuries. But then Shakespeare appears in front of me, to whom I owe so much. I try to hate the Muslims, but Ghalib gets in the way. You tell me, can anyone stand up to him? I want to hate the Sikhs, but Guru Nanak fills my vision and my head bows down of its own accord. And this Kamban Tyagaraja Muthuswami, a million times I tell myself, they are not mine, they are from the far south. But my heart does not rest until it makes them my own. And that woman I loved, who betrayed me for the first time, I will kill her as soon as I see her. I do see her, but sometimes she meets me as a friend, sometimes a mother, sometimes a sister, and so I swallow a gulp of love. All my days, I wander like a madman looking for someone I can hate to my heart's content and feel light. But the opposite happens. Someone at some place or time I find that I cannot help but love. Day by day, my love disease is growing and a suspicion has taken root. And one day this love will send me straight to heaven. This translation is taken from the website called dark.co.in. That's all from my presentation. If there is anything else, I would clarify during the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Asit, for your presentation on literary translation from below. Basically, that was the idea that you were trying to foreground, and you were looking at several aspects and with certain examples with theoretical background too. Thank you very much for that. We will move to the next presentation, which is by Ajay. So without wasting much of our time, we will ask questions to Asit at the end of the session. Thank you. Ajay, if you could please start.
Yeah, please. Please, but I'm sharing my screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes, Ajay, it is visible.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Myself, Ajay Varma, Alluri. I am currently pursuing my post-graduation, that is MA in Comparative Literature in University of Hyderabad. Besides, I am a literary translator working among the Indian languages, Kannada, Telugu, and Odia, and along with from English to these languages. So today my paper is titled, What is Comparative Translation? This paper is part of my MA dissertation. This is the first chapter of my MA dissertation that I am working at the Center of Comparative Literature, University of Hyderabad. Without further delay, I move into the paper. So I began my paper by giving some anecdotal information that led to me think what may be the question. I mean, what is comparative translation? Few years ago, when I took up the project of translating Arbol de Diana, Spanish poems of an unsung Argentinian poetess, Alejandra Pizarnik, into Kannada, referring to the translation of Yvette Seegert, English translation of Yvette Seegert, I felt amazed after coming across yet another translation, English translation by Cecilia Rossi. I, who thought of depending on Seegert version, being unaware of any other English version, went on referring to the translations of Cecilia Rossi in parallel to that of Seegert. In the meantime, I came across yet another English translation rendered collaboratively by Joseph Mulligan and Patricia Rossi. Very soon, I got to read a few selected poems in Ana Deni Morales' translation, published in an anthology of Latin American poetry titled Winds in the Night. It was the time when Anna was working on her manuscript of Diana's Tree to publish it in England. Having these three different translations in hand, baffling with the differences among all the three versions, waiting for Anna's translation to get published, I wondered if there were any existent translations that I felt unnoticed, that I left unnoticed. So it was rather a difficult task for me to assess the best among all, which will serve as my secondary source text, as I don't know Spanish. I neither knew Spanish to ascertain which words or choices appropriate among the different usages, nor any Spanish speaker who could help me with the primary source. If I had known Spanish, I wouldn't have bothered with these mediating English versions and the task of comparing them. Thanks to my poor knowledge in Spanish, which had put me into this task and made me to realize how the different translations of the same text will be in a complex interrelationship with one another. Thanks to Mukunda Ramarao Garu, whose Telugu translation of 3 poems from Diana's Tree stirred me, thereby motivating me to look for an English translation of the book. To carry the Kannada translation, as a result, I first got Sigurd version and then others in the order I mentioned before. After reading all the translations closely and comparatively, I couldn't figure out whose translation is best among all. Each translation is best in its own way under different yardsticks. I decided not to solely depend on one translation, but to devise a new translation as an ideal combination of all the translations available, and to carry out the Kannada translation from that ideal combination. The new version thus devised is skeletal and is such that if one poem in Kannada translation is based on Sigurd's version, the other poem is based on Cecilia's version. Sometimes, if the starting lines of a particular poem is based on Mulligan Patrica's version, the ending lines are based on Anna's version. And in most of the cases, a poem is based on different words, phrases, and lines from all the English translations. This combination didn't follow any deliberate sequence, but is based on the poetic merit of the translations, which was evident in the word choice and expression and the artistic temperament chosen by the different translators. For instance, let us see the poem 2 from Arbol de Diana. This is the Spanish original. I read, Estas son las versiones que nos propone un agujero, una pared que tiembla. It was written by Alejandro Pizarnik in 1962. Now, I give the 4 different English translations of this small couplet. So, Cecilia Rossi's translation reads as follows. These are the versions suggested: a hole, a trembling wall, which is published in 2010. And then is Joseph Mulligan and Rossi's version. These are the versions she put on the table: a hole, a wall that shakes. And this is by Sigurd's version, which I first got. These are the some possible versions: a hole, a trembling wall. And lastly, Anna's version. These are the versions put forth to us: a pinhole, a wall that trembles. Yeah, what I say is, I hope this small poem with all its available translations in English is enough to make you wonder if you are reading the different translations of the same poem or different poems altogether. It shows how difficult it is to judge a translation, that to when one is inefficient in the language it is written in. So this Spanish couplet remains as a couplet in all the English translation. Obviously, no translation among the 4 is in complete equivalency with any of the other translations. Sigurd's translation is syntactically similar to Cecilia's translation, while Anna's translation is to Patrica's. It is only Sigurd's translation that uses the word some, and giving a hint that there may be few other versions left behind. While the remaining translations used, these are the versions, implying a tone that these are the only versions. It is only Mulligan's and Patrica's translation that contains the phrase she puts on the table, while other translations doesn't have any reference to either she or table. Second line in Cecilia's translation, very interestingly similar, very totally similar to that of Sigurd's translation. Mulligan and Patrica and Anna's translation seem to have followed the syntax of the original. Their translation of the second line differs merely by a word choice, that is, whole to pinhole and shakes to trembles. Here, whole and tremble will be the generic, while pinhole and shake will be specific. It is only Anna's translation that includes us, the word us, in the poem. So, the differences which I have pointed out here among all these translations may be minor, only the minor differences, but they are substantial. They are minor yet substantial, like different translation, like different shades of the same color. If you take the red color, you will have numerous shades of the red color: crimson red, light red, royal red, so on. So these versions are like the shades of the different color. Considering all these differences, the skeletal version which I have devised to carry out my Kannada translation is as follows. These are the versions she often puts on: a hole, a wall that trembles. So I have made these type of skeletal versions of the ideal combination of different English translations, and I have rendered all these 38 poems into Kannada, and it was published in 2018 as Jayana Mara in Kannada. This is my translation of the Arbol de Dayana. It is an indirect translation from 4 different mediating English versions. So now I call this skeletal version, which I have devised to carry out my Kannada translation, as collage translation, because my translations were based on collage of words, phrases, and lines taken from different translations. But although this collage translation embraces all the available English versions, more particularly the possible interpretations of the poem, it makes the idea of secondary source more abstract. Because, and one more thing is, it also distances the translator from the norms of faithfulness and fidelity. If one is carrying a direct translation, is fidelity, the translator's fidelity, whatever may be its degree, it will be to the source text. In the primary language it is written, source language it is written in. If the translator carries out an indirect translation, its fidelity will be to the mediating source text or the secondary source text. But if anyone is carrying a collage translation like this, who don't know the source language, but having different mediating versions in front of them, they will carry collage translation, and they might carry collage translation as I did. And the fidelity is neither to the source text, nor to the strictly to the secondary text, but the fidelity will be in a collective fidelity to the different translations available. So the difference is what I have pointed out earlier in the 4 different translations of the Spanish poem. I think this is enough to reveal the complexity of intertextuality that will take place between the multiple translations of the same literary text. To understand the dynamics of these differences, so it is necessary to read the different translations of the same text between the lines. That is why I made this question, what is comparative translation? Comparative translation is the study of different translations of the same text in terms of their form, content, and style, thereby marking the linguistic, cultural, and contextual differences. One can also pursue comparative translation as a field, conglomerating the ideas and theories of comparative literature and translation studies. Despite of this etymological balance between these 2 disciplines of comparative literature and translation studies, comparative translation leans more towards a translation studies, for it is primarily a translation study. Along with this, the theories from comparative literature and translation studies, comparative translation also depends much on the theoretical discourse that is happening nowadays in what we call translation criticism. So to understand in a more deeper way what is comparative translation, I think we should know the politics and how the processes of multiple translations takes place. Most of the literary classics, irrespective of what language they are written in, celebrate the privilege of getting translated into other languages of the world. Among them, only few classics, beside their first translation in a given language, often get translated again and again in the same language by different translators from time to time. These more than one translations of the same text, same source text, translated by different translators or same translators into a particular target language across time are known as multiple translations. There is a possibility that a same translator can translate the text second time also. So these translations, I mean, if the translator which he has already rendered, if he is carrying the second translation of it, or in one sense he is revising his earlier translations, then they are largely known as re-editions of the previous translations. Or in others, to put more about this point, a famous translation scholar, Anthony Pym, he regards that re-editions would tend to reinforce the validity of the previous translations. I mean, most of the translators, they usually do re-editions only to establish the validity of the translations, what they have done before. If different translators are carrying out the multiple translations of the same text, they are often called as multiple translations. I mean, the products are known as multiple translations. Nowadays, they are often called as retranslations also. But there is a huge difference between these multiple translations and retranslations, which I will later tell in my upcoming slides. So, since I am talking about comparative translations, these multiple translations are the bread and butter for comparative translation. Say, I have told this multiple translations are bread and butter for comparative translation because it is the existence of yet another translation for any existing translation that makes the activity of comparison possible. We can compare the other two translations only if the translation is available. So multiple translation is the mainstay for comparative translation. But the question is, what necessitates the emergence of other translation, or what politics are there behind this emergence of new translations is an interesting feat to ponder upon. So the reasons, the motives behind multiple translators and translations are what I have listed, are the possibilities. In very few cases, multiple translations or the new translation happen when the translator is completely unaware of the pre-existing translation. In a few other cases, it happens when the translator is greatly interested in translating it again, being aware of the pre-existing translation and irrespective of its quality. In some other cases, it happens because of the translator's dissatisfaction with the quality of the pre-existing translation. And in most of the cases, it happens if the translator feels the need, there will be a need to revise the linguistic outdatedness of the pre-existing translation. In addition to these possibilities, there may be chances for new translation to happen if the pre-existing translation is an indirect translation. In addition to all these possibilities, these days we often encounter different publishers, globally acclaimed publishers. They will be commissioning different translators to carry out the new translations of the literary classics. Here, I'm quoting from Rainer Skuld, who regards that the study of multiple translations of a single poem, you can generalize it for any genre, which he tells for the poem. Single poem can enlarge the translator's understanding of the text, and the translation theorist can learn from the literary translator's research into the criteria for the evaluation of translations. Sujit Mukherjee, famous translation scholar in Indian academia, is in his seminal essay, Translation as Discovery, compares 6 different English translations of the 2 stanzas of a Bangla poem, Bonalata Shane by Jivanananda Das, and gives the long commentary about the differences among the translation. I quote Sujit Mukherjee here: "The obligation to force equivalence compels the translator to look closely at the original as well as to consider carefully what alternatives he can offer in translation. The translator, is tested in terms of perception, what he makes of the original text. The variations offered by translators, even if they are misread the original, confirm that the original, like all good poetry, seem to have more than one meaning. All the possibilities, including the wrong ones, should be apparent to the translator before he chooses one which seems to him more apt, not only for the single word or the particular line, but for the entire poem." What I believe is this is true for any literary genre that undergoes multiple translations, not particularly to poetry. Now, I'm going to talk about what are retranslations. So, every translation will reflect the poetics of the period during which it is produced, or during which it is translated. With the passage of time, due to modifications in the language and change of target readership, the old poetics doesn't cope with the poetics of the present day, then the pre-existing translation in one or other sense gets outdated, calling for new translation to happen. The new translation that thus emerged will have the privilege of making pre-existing translation as its secondary source text, besides the original. Antonio Varma, a famous French translation scholar, has termed this new translation that emerges as a reviving rendition of the previous version as retranslation. So, retranslation refers to the action of translating a work that has previously been translated into the same language in order to update the obsolete language, in order to improve the quality of translation, in order to account for a revised edition of the source text, or it may be also because another translator wishes to present a new interpretation or creative response to add his creative response to the text. But this concept of retranslation, which we often come across translation studies and which is much developed in Western academia, there is a study called retranslation studies in Western academia. It should not be confused with back translation, which is translation of translated text back to its source language. And retranslation should also not to be confused with relay translation, which is translation of a translated text into another target language, which is also known as indirect translation. These terms should not be confused, because these two are also the retranslations, which are also known as translations of translations. So what Lawrence Venuti, famous translation theorist, opines here is about retranslations. Retranslations are designed to challenge a previous version of the source text. They are likely to construct a more dense and complex intertextuality so as to signify and call attention to their competing interpretation. Venuti perceives translation as a value-creating phenomenon, like any other cultural practice we come across. Then translation, the retranslation, according to Venuti, must be recreating the values against the established old values established by pre-existing translations. To give one example, famous example of the retranslation is, we all know the largely translated text in world is Bible. The famous King James version, authorized version of 1611, the translator's preface in the translator's preface to the King James version, they mention that the translators mentioned that it was not their purpose to make a new translation, but to make the good one better. Thus, giving a clue that they are modifying the translation based on the pre-existing translation, that they are implying that they are carrying the retranslation. So, as I have already told, Antonio Varma, famous French translation scholar, in his famously known retranslation hypothesis of 1990, published in a special issue of the journal Palimpsests, Varma argued that the Tibet translation, the debut translation of a text is always an incomplete act. It is always an incomplete act. It is the translation that completes the process. According to him, according to Varma, earlier translations of the text are largely target-oriented, while the series of retranslations are source-oriented. But I don't agree with Varma, because if we go by Varma's argument, there must be a gradual shift of domestication to the foreignization and contemporization of language among the translations that usually do not happen in all the retranslations we take. And as Koskinen and Palopsky argue that the first translations are not always domesticating, and neither all the subsequent ones are progressively more foreignizing. Do I have time? Hello.
I think you could finish in 3 or 4 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'll definitely. Okay. Now I come to the notion of what is meant by aging of translations. Again, the Bergman, French translation scholar, he argues that while the original text remains forever young, translations will age with the passage of time, thus giving rise to a new translation, need for new translations. However, he additionally argues, not all translations are equally affected by the passage of time. Not all translations will necessarily age. Those that stand the test of time and match the endurance of the original may be thought as great translations. Again, his argument is what I totally believe as downplaying the role of translations over the ever superior original taught by the readers or theorists. So my question is, can it be agreed that originals stay forever young? I think no. If you go, if you go across Samuel Richardson's famous novel, epistolary novel, Clarissa, it is clearly noted by different scholars that Samuel Richardson, in his lifetime, he has edited that Clarissa for so many times. To quote one particular printed line in his first edition, he revised that particular line almost. Records are available. 364 revisions had made by him in his second version, and 375 revisions has been made by him in third edition, totally amounting to 739 different versions or different revisions of single line in his Clarissa. So I argue, if a writer who lives for more than 1,000 years, will he? I don't think so that he will not. He always edits his writing, is what I believe. Here, the notion of authority, the authority that the writer claims over his writing comes into picture, while the translator has no authority to change his writing, the writing of the writer. So my question is also, at what age does the existing translation call for a new translation? If we agree for Bergman that he is telling translations will age, but my question is, at what age? Who determines the age? At what age this translation becomes old or it ages? So I have given here statistical information of different translations. You can say either multiple translations or retranslations of the famous French novel written by Gustave Flaubert, that is Madame Bovary. I have listed here the 15 different translations of Madame Bovary. You can notice that the translation period that happened is totally aperiodical and totally simultaneous in some cases, because here I have given the period between the successive translations. Here you can notice it as 0, so that the question is whether to call it as retranslation or not. And the question is again whether to call the particular translation as the retranslation to the first version or retranslation to the previous version is the question. So it is really a complex thing to work upon. So I have given one more novel from Indian literature, the famous novel by Fakir Mohan Senapati, Chaumana Ottagunta, and its 5 different English translations. Interestingly, no title among these 5 different translations has the literal meaning. The literal meaning is Chaumana Ottagunta, 6 acres and 8 guntas, but no title in the English translation has done it literally. And more interestingly, if you just look peripherally over the titles, here the second translation is 6 acres and a off, and the other translation is 6 acres and a third, which differs also in quantity, maybe due to the change in time. So, and here interestingly, the first 2 translations came out in the same year. So you cannot figure out what is retranslation, or these translations have occurred independently. So I quickly quote from Anthony Pym that he distinguishes 2 different types of retranslations. One is passive retranslations that are separated by geographical distance or time and do not have any bearing on another, and active translations that share the same cultural and temporal location and are indicative of disagreements over translation strategies, challenging the validity of previous translations. I quickly go with last two slides. I mean, in comparative translation, the question is what we compare. The same question we have been bothering with the comparative literature from many years, that too in comparative translation, what we usually compare. What we usually compare is different translation strategies and norms, taken up by different translators, we compare. And we also compare the structure and style, the structural and stylistic elements of employed by different translators. We also compare the linguistic and cultural expressions carried out by the translators, and artistic and temperament and aesthetic ideas, and more interestingly, the question of untranslatability. Because we all know that what something is untranslatable to me is not necessarily untranslatable to some other translator. So this concept of untranslatability or translatability is always relative. So this comparative translation necessarily measures what is the relative untranslatability between two different translators or among many different translators of the same text. So my last, I think I'll skip this slide. I want to add one important note here. Ulenu and Zeng's statement. I mean, these are the prominent scholars who has done some groundwork on comparative translation from Durham University. I want to only elaborate on one point. They argue that comparative translation also includes a comparison between different translations of the same translator. I found it rather interesting because if I am translating two different authors, I should not be same in my expression. Rather, I should render the expression of a writer A into translation and writer B differently into the translation. If you are reading my two different translations of different writers, you should not feel that both are written by the same writer. So I should be somewhat invisible in my translation. So my last slide, what are the levels of comparison? The first one is SLT1 and SLT2. This is source language translation, which is rendered into the again source language translation, which is intralingual translations, comparing two translations intralingually. If it is the rendition of a short story, if you are converting it into a play, you can compare the short story and the play, that is the adaptation. You can also compare source language translation and source language adaptation. And source language translation to target language translation adaptation, and source language to target language, which any scholar in translation studies does. You can also compare a source language text with two different translations available. If you don't know the source language, then you can compare the three different translations available to you. And this is the very typical case. If the scholar, translation studies scholar, is a polyglot or is multilingual, he can compare translations of a particular novel in two different languages. Say, for example, you can quote the example of Vaikam Muhammad Bashir's Balyakala Sakhe, which is written in Malayalam. Since I know both Kannada and Telugu, I can compare Balyakala Sakhe, Malayalam novel in Kannada as Balyakala Sakhe, and Chinna Nati Chele in Telugu. I can compare them since I know the languages, and these comparisons had more information and more problems of how translations takes place. Yeah, I'm concluding. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ajay, for your elaborate presentation on comparative translations. You call it comparative translations. There is this idea of multiple translation too, and you have looked into different aspects of it. You have talked about collage translation. You have talked about why do multiple translations actually happen, what are the reasons, and how do these multiple translations happen, and things like that, which was very, very interesting and very, very elaborate presentation. I'm sure it has provoked a great degree of curiosity among the audience with respect to different aspects of translation studies and translation theories. I look forward to the question and answer session. I'm sure there will be heated discussions. With that, let me just go on. Next presenter. Could you, Nimish Sharma? Yes. Am I correct? Nimish K. Sharma?
Yes.
Please do start your presentation, Mr. Nimish K. Sharma. You have about 20 minutes for that.
Sure, sir. I'm trying to share the screen. Okay. Yeah. Is my screen visible?
Yes, yes, it is visible.
Yes, it's visible.
Sure, I'll start. So, There is no one answer to what poetry is. Neither does everyone share the same ideas about a specialized language of poetry. The debates on peculiarity of peculiar languages still rage. Much less then can be assumed about the equivalences in genres and their expectations of poetry and of metaphorical use of language. All of this is determined culturally and temporally, but also in the dynamics of individual use. None of this makes the translator's task easy. However, to gloss over such a determinative factor is to essentialize and to trivialize, even if the medium is not the message. An overt belief in the separability of the message from its context reifies a hegemonic view of how meaning is generated. How far can a translator actually reproduce a work? As Popovic points out, the translator has the right to differ organically and to be independent. Bassnett qualifies this as if that independence is pursued for the sake of the original in order to reproduce it as a living work. Even translations, as we know, and as discussed by the previous presenters, is reproduced anew continuously because every version is context bound, representing a reading accessible to the time in which it is produced, and is moreover individualistic, as Vanity points out. Translation of the ghazal form to be representative for the sake of the source author must be mindful of the subjectively defined inner logic of the original, as Dharwadkar calls it. This inner logic is made up of implicit components and meaning, not only in the original language, but in its literary tradition and ambient culture. The bhavarth, or the implied meaning, dhvani, or suggestiveness, or the sandarbh, the context. The explicit cannot make sense without this implicit, and the translator task may be to be mindful of this difficulty because the translator, I quote, translates the text and its readers simultaneously, as Dharwadkar calls it. We are bound thus to ask, are ghazal translators bringing the reader close to the ghazal, or in the globalized translation space that silently pursues neo-colonial transactions? It reproduces only what the target languages are seen to want. A common complaint of ghazal translation is indeed its highly specialized form. It is a genre that in simple words takes labor to get into, wrongly classified as lyric, which implies a certain kind of logic to be imposed upon it. The ghazal follows a highly specified group of themes, motifs, and metaphors within a strict metrical and rhyming pattern. There is also the refrain or radif, which is optional but made pertinent by our greatest poets in its sheer scope of possibilities. Thus, if the translation process is, I quote, one in which we tentatively and precariously arrive at meanings of one cultural context and reinscribe them, however inadequately, in another, as Rita Kothari calls it, the translator's plight is in making this system cross over into a language where such equivalent traditions do not seem to flourish, and with its own particular ideas about how poetry should be. It is important to be mindful of assumptions a target language reader can make of what is poetry, and thus to understand that this seemingly universal view is nothing but privileged by power and is also contextual, and what is being translated comes from one of the alternate lines of thought. The idea of poetry being natural and flowing from the common idiom of the time still dominates much of our contemporary poetic output, where meter and rhyme are eschewed as archaisms unless used for parody and lampooning. The ghazal, on the other hand, wears its artificiality on its sleeve, as F.W. Pritchett calls it. It is a form of highly condensed abstractions where unity of the larger poem is relevant to the modern sense of thematic unity, where the formal constraints are as rigid as subjectivity and ambiguity are encouraged. Tejaswini Niranjana suggests that translation both shapes and takes shape within the asymmetric relations of power that operate in colonialism. Even a translator situated in India cannot remain innocent of this. A person situated in colonial ground is no less in a state of translation, to quote. To ignore this is to situate the post-colonial firmly outside the colony, or to deny the colony or what has been the colony in the post-colonial space, as Harish Trivedi has argued. If the translator would make the original invisible for the sake of translatability, it is not innocent. It erases that which it seeks to represent. If one wants to agree that it is not just representing it, but also to represent it. This necessitates a view into the context of production of the classical Urdu ghazal. Now the discussion will move to certain important aspects of the literary theory as developed by the practitioners of what we call the Urdu poetry of the classical phase, which is pre-1857, roughly. deriving from the Sabke Hindi Persian poets, who are the Indian poets who wrote in Persian, but influenced as well by the Sanskrit literary theory and the poetic practices of the linguistic continuum of the languages we now call Urdu and Hindi. For the sake of this discussion, we derive much of the research from S.R. Farooqi's seminal work Sher-e-Shorangez and Ardi Urdu Literary Culture and History. So, Fakhruddin Nizami was writing in 15th century, early 15th century, and he wrote a Masnavi called Kadam Rao Padam Rao, and it was written in Dakkani. And here we can see, like in these 6 lines, the poetic concerns of the time, if we can see him as a representative of the time. So a poem that doesn't have dual meaning words, such a poem does not attract anyone at all. So what we see here is a pedestalization of the double entendre, or more broadly, an ambiguity of meaning. The concept is called iham and has been valorized here and has been documented, in fact, in Amir Khusro's dibachas or introductions to his divans, and also in Mir, Soda, and many other canonical poets of the Urdu Ghazal. It has been connected to the Dhwani theory of Anand Vardhana too. Here, one meaning is more apparent while other is implied, concealed underneath the text, where there is a temporal difference in the implied meaning being made apparent in the process of reception. Khusro's introduction to his third divan, Gurrat al-Kamal, also outlines another important aspect of this poetic translation. As Farooqi says, Khusro stresses that, I quote, that poetry is a body of knowledge in its own right, that it was concerned with larger issues, not with the statement of truth seen from a personal or objective standpoint. Thus, a specialized mode of knowledge that poetry is can sustain its own logic in its own world, not defined or constrained by the mimetic compulsions. Now, Khusro also demonstrates a concern that becomes more prevalent as Urdu poetic culture develops. At one point, he takes great pride in having created 7 different meanings from his text using a single mark of punctuation. This linguistic game of production of multiple meanings becomes one of the central criterions of poetic excellence in this tradition. Allied to this is what Farooqi calls the first major discovery in the theory of these poets, which is that a distinction could be made between mani and mazmoon. So mazmoon is roughly the theme, mani is meaning, and these words were being used sort of synonymously in the Arabic and Persian text before this time, but it is considered an Indian intervention into the field, where the mazmoon and mani are considered to be 2 different things. So what a poem is about and what a poem can mean can be different and can be related also, but they are considered separately. And this idea becomes central. And also on authorial intent, the traditional dictum, which is seen across texts, is that a meaning can only be seen or found if the author has put it there. So this conception, as broad it is, allowed poets to interpret poetry in various ways, and if they could justify their interpretation in terms of the larger tradition, it becomes valid. The intentionalism becomes irrelevant as a matter of inquiry, and a meaning is permissible in the sense that it holds up against the larger context and the subtext of poetic creation. This is outlined by the Persian poet Bedil, the Indian Persian poet Bedil, in his Chahr-e-Shur. Bedil himself, as many of us know, was one of the formative influences of Mirza Ghalib's poetry, whose poems we're going to assess further. Thus, this tradition developed with an emphasis on abstract, subtle thought, the centrality of metaphor, the global reach of imagination, and value on figures of speech, as Farooqi opines. A discussion of all the concepts traditionally understood as integral to the poetics of the classical Urdu tradition is beyond the scope of this paper. So here we will stick to Mani Afrini and Mazmoon Afrini, which is the distinction of theme and meaning well established. Now the themes that were permissible in poetry were theoretically infinite. Yet they were accepted in context of the larger intertextual tradition with nods to the established themes created by the established masters. Thus, the search for new acceptable themes or for new ways to express old themes became a, I quote, noble occupation for the poet and was called Mazmoon Afrini, or the creation of themes. Mani Afrini was then the creation of meanings within these themes. If a particular poem is particularly strong on Mani Afrini, it means that it produces new interpretative possibilities. Here, Iham's polarity of suggested and apparent meanings has given way to an almost rhizomatic system of various possibilities.
Ghalib was particularly given to this kind of poetry. In a letter to a friend providing islah, which is correction on someone else's writing, usually provided by an ustad to a shagird, ustad being the master and shagird being the disciple. He says that ghazal is meaning creation and not the measuring of rhymes. This privileging of meaning creation over the metrical aspect of poetry is not to say that the formal is irrelevant, but that the formal and the content, if they can be separated, and if the classical theorists would be thinking in those binaries, probably not, serve to create multiple meanings within the poem. Again, this is not to say that all shares in the ghazal have to have multiple meanings or multiple interpretive possibilities. There are other criteria of assessment like shorangezi and kafiyat, which are understood in emotive terms or even reader response terms. There is no evidence that this literary theory, unlike any other, was a monolith. The attempt here is to merely outline the focus on the fact that the poets of the classical ghazal were not looking for a single authoritative meaning in their text. Indeed, some of their central concerns were abstraction and ambiguity, which are expressed through various specialized themes and metaphors. The centrality of this is important when our concern is translation. Translation by the very action is interpretation, and if the translator is not mindful, can privilege one meaning when the genre itself entails ambiguities and possibilities. As we shall see, this tenet is sometime ignored to the point of misinterpretation, even by those who profess that there can never be one translation. The primary translation we look into is Ghazals of Ghalib, versions from the Urdu. This is edited by Ajay Ahmad. The collection has been picked for its methodology, wherein 10 English poets were selected, and they were given literal translations by Ajay Ahmad, who also supplied them supplementary material and suggestions on how to translate it, then set free in a way to create to transcreate and to make what they will as poems. And the criteria is that the multiplicity of responses is sought by design, and they agree that there is no one way to translate, and like they strive for, I quote, they strive for more than one inspired approximation, not by accident, but by design. Together, all these versions may, it is hoped, create an intense impression of Ghalib's mind and moral universe. The central concerns that Ahmad discusses in the introduction to the volume, which to an average reader might serve as an introduction to the genre itself, does take up many important issues. Ajaz Ahmad outlines that the main tradition of Urdu poetry is, I quote, highly condensed, reflective verse with abundance and variety of lyrical efforts, verbal complexity, and metaphorical abstraction. And this preference for abstraction is not, as should be obvious, merely a characteristic of language, but it is also a way of thinking, end quote. Ahmad is also intensely aware of the colonial onslaught on the Urdu poetry tradition perpetrated to this day. I quote, if he wasn't already a Victorian romanticist, he's talking about Ghalib, he had to be made into one. If the tradition of Urdu poetry wasn't already minor or trivial, the design of the empire demanded that the triviality be imposed upon it. For decades, major Urdu poets were being read according to standards set by minor English ones. And this, many scholars have pointed out that the vestiges of this onslaught still carry on, as documented by Farooqi and F.W. Pritchett. Altogether, Ajaz Ahmad demonstrates his position as an eminent thinker and scholar for the Urdu literature, as an insider or as someone who knows the tradition, and he's performing a work of self-representation to a decidedly Western audience, as he acknowledges. The weight here is a representation of what one knows and seeks for others to know as well. Concomitantly, Ahmad believes that translations worth their salt, a poetic translation, must have poetic qualities. As A.K. Ramanujan said, a translation of poem can only be a poem, and he agrees with that. So he allows interpretive possibilities on the translator side, but to stay true to what Ghalib would mean, it would seem. So far, so good. Yet there are certain problems that arise from translation by the mere mediation performed by Ahmad. So we'll look into 3 shares by Ghalib from the ghazal Bas ke dushwar hai har kaam ka aasan hona, and we'll look at Ajaz Ahmad's literal translation. Then we'll look at the translation made by Adrian Rich following Ajaz Ahmad's literal translation, not from the direct but in direct translation. Then we'll compare these two translations created by Sarwat Rahman, who has translated Ghalib's complete Diwan, and it is a rhyme translation. It also tries to follow the metrical schizm of the original. And F.W. Pritchett and Cornwall's recent translation, which is focused more on the literal ideas, and even when there are Urdu compounds, so it tries to maintain the structure of the compounds and the linguistic qualities. So this is a more literal translation. So all these translations are to be compared to each other for the 3 verses. Now, this first verse, this is the matla of the poem, the first sher that comes. So बस के दुश्वार है हर काम का आसान होना, आदमी को भी मैसर नहीं इंसान होना. And the point of focus here is the bas ki. So it is something which we can say, like, it has a semantic point because it is a remarkable open phrase that contains within it nuances of tone, which signifies multiple connotations that can be emphasized in its utterance. Ahmed's literal translation is, it is found that, and it thereby loses focus of the exasperation, disdain, or a sigh of gloom that can be expressed with this phrase. Ajaz Ahmed replaces the more emotive tone of the original with a matter-of-factly idiomatic expression, which is then reflected in the well-composed lines of Adrian Rich. What we lose out on is perhaps what the poet could have done with the beautiful possibilities of that word. The mediation is restrictive here in terms of tone. So the other translators have still come sort of towards the real meaning of Baski, which is like they can be approximate at least, which is when Sarwat Rahman translates, it becomes surely, and when Pritchard and Cornwell translate, it becomes although, which is basically to maintain some of the emotive aspects of the original word, which then entails the creation of multiple meanings that can come from this usage, which are lost in the idiomatic use. The next verse we look into shows the mediation being more restrictive in the sense, and this is more in interpretive sense and not in tonal sense. So, why दीवानगी ये शौक कि हरदम मुझको आप जाना उधर और आप ही हैरान होना. So Ajaz Ahmed's literal translation is, what madness of attachment is it that I should every instant in that direction go by my own will and all by myself become perturbed at not finding her there. So the original text does not have a her and does not have a meeting place. So what is happening here, and the other two translators, Adrian Rich is of course following Ajaz Ahmed, other 2 translators demonstrate that. So this is a more abstract verse. It does not have a meeting place. It does not have a sheet. Does not even have a subject in that sense. All it says is that the impassioned person goes somewhere and again and finds himself perplexed. Nothing else is told. Yet Ajaz Ahmed imposes a complete situation onto this wonderfully ambiguous and powerful utterance about the nature of desire, longing, and ardor, and turns it into another share about the lover's predicament. Granted, it is a possibility within the text, but it is a possibility in context of all other possibilities, which could just as easily have been retained as demonstrated by the other 2 translators. Translating the words stressed in the true lines, that is, Divangi Ashok and Hera, where the stress falls in terms of meter and how it is pronounced, proves itself difficult enough, but the other translators are able to produce something satisfactory. Ajaz Ahmed's mediating.
Nimish, you have about 3 more minutes, 3 to 4 more minutes. Yeah.
So I'll conclude. Ajaz Ahmed's mediating influence has made Rich's translation completely off-putting in context of the original, its own flow and beauty aside. I'll gloss over some points here, and let's look at the final share, and then I'll make concluding points. So what happens in this share is, the first reading the share is, ले गए खाक में हम दागे तमन्नाए नशात तू हो और आप बस अदरंगे गुलिस्तान होना. So what is happening here is the word aap, the way it can be used produces many interpretations with the text, and all of them are represented by the translations that we have here. So how Ajaz Ahmed interprets it is how Adrian Rich then poetically translates it, right? And this becomes to Adrian Rich a tale of disparity between the lover and the beloved. One is scarred and disappointed in the grave, while the other is alive as a rainbow glistening in the orchid. To Pritchard and Cornwell, the 100-colored garden is the defeated lover's defined metaphysical afterlife. To Rahman, it is the lover's poignant wish for the beloved's flourishing from beyond the grave, which again can carry a hint of irony if we read that way. All possibilities remain valid with the text, and who is to say that another reading is not possible? If ghazal is given to such a multiplicity of interpretations, any real representation of it must have to take it into account. Ajaz Ahmed seems to do this but the traffic is one-sided. He has granted the translator the freedom of interpretation, but not the long-gone author. If the long-gone author or the larger context within which he worked was to be consulted, both the translator and the author have their reasons for producing different interpretations. Thus, the restriction in Ahmed's work happens at the mediation, where the editor seems to gloss over the ambiguity of the original and its possibilities for meaning creation. So a worthwhile attempt at translation that nonetheless creates beautiful poetry remains at the end an unfulfilled project because of the unwillingness to see original in its own terms and then translate it. Arguing with Venuti that the translator's invisibility reproduces the hegemonic view of poetry onto translations, one concomitantly sees that the visible translator obscures the author's context and renders it invisible. Both are sides of the same coin. In today's globalized system, where various literatures attempt for their space in the ever-rigid canon of world literature, the responsibility to represent the literature for the translators who are either from within the traditions or scholar of it, as seen in these three translations, is immense. To be mindful of not reproducing the dominant view of poetry in today's world in a poetic genre that sees it differently is of utmost importance. At the same time, as Kothari warns, when different linguistic and ethnic communities draw attention to their cultural uniqueness, the urge of uniqueness, culture itself becomes a scramble for self-representation. This urge for representation makes space for concessions to reach a larger audience, or if not a larger, then a more global audience, makes one perform what Fanon calls the colonial cringe. So, we know that the ghazal tradition has survived 12 centuries. It started in Arabia. It went as far as the Iberian Peninsula and came to the Indian subcontinent, which has made its own home. And here also, in the multilingual space of the pre-colonial times, and also in today's multilingual space, multiple languages have made the ghazal its own. And so, as the ghazal now makes its headway into English, this alternative method of literary assessment, the modes of this alternative literary theory can only enrich the global space. But for that, it is the responsibility of the mediators to not just reproduce their own view, but one negotiated with the alternative modes of seeing poetry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nimish K. Sharma, for a very interesting presentation on ghazal translation, basically for the kind of theoretical concepts that you were trying to bring forth. Man Afrini and Mazmoon Afrini, I hope I'm getting it correct.
Yes,
that was interesting. That was really very, very enlightening. I was also interested in the way in which these concepts could be compared with some of the Indian aesthetic concepts in the Indian aesthetic tradition. So thank you for that. And it was indeed your observations are well taken with respect to ghazal translation and the idea of multiple translations which are there. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you for questions. We'll now move on to the third presenter. We have, may I request the fourth presenter. Can I just request our fourth presenter, Amir Bashir, if I'm correct, to please start the presentation. So thank you very much.
Yes, I'm present in the seminar. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank all for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this wonderful conference. And I would also like to apologize here that due to some technical problems, I would not be in a position to share my PPT with all of you. So I hope that I'll be forgiven for that. So far as my topic is concerned, which is reconstitution of Feather's poetry, a study of translation of Feather's poetry in English by Aga Shahid Ali and Shivki Kumar, where we have the basis of translation and reconstitution of language, which is quite initiative in nature, and from time to time, the need of translation and reconstitution of language had been felt to understand the culture and linguistic variation. As we know that the practice of reconstituting language was there from the beginning of human evolution, although unknowingly they tried certain codes to interpret the signs and to understand the other communication. But with the passage of time and progression in the human understanding, humans tried to know the other languages into their own dominant language. History witnessed early translations, which had made because of the compulsion of knowing about the religious scriptures into their own vernacular languages, that made innumerable religious scriptures to be translated into the whatever vernacular languages for the convenience of the public. The sense of translation has come into the discourse of taking up a word-to-word or direct translation of a scripture to constitute a language with the formation of understanding different languages or into a different language itself. In this case, many great translators have rendered the idea of constituting a language through a simple discourse of direct translation, which makes a sense of word-to-word translation of a language, and this idea had been embarked by Cicero and Horace. Not only Cicero and Horace, who rendered and developed an idea of traversing the language for the reconstitution of other languages. It was indeed a more influential discourse of the morning star of Reformation, John Wycliffe, who in his translation of Bible has developed an impression of translating the scriptures of Latin Bible into the vernacular language, with the motive that God's law should be accessible to all in their own convenient language. Not only Wycliffe, who made it to concept of translation, besides there were many other translators who have translated not only the Bible, but other scriptures so as to know the literary genres time to time, which have been written in other languages. In this perspective, the discourse which my topic, reconstitution of as poetry is serving to analyze the textual difference in carrying out an idea of a language that the translators who reconstitutes language from their own point of understanding, where they seem to reconstitute a word in a very different form other than the translator itself, who reconstitutes it in another sense, as the reconstitute Aga Shahid Ali and Shiv K. Kumar have dealt the poems of Faiz differently to reconstitute a language in their own understanding. In this regard, the poems which I have chosen here for the discourse of reconstitution of language to see particularly the difference in reconstitution carried out by these two translators. I mean, it's like a comparative study of translations of both the translators in different ways they have done. And the poems which I have chosen are Mujhse Pehli Si Mohabbat Mere Mehboob Na Maan, Tanhai, Aaye Ho Shab Intizar Guzri, Gulo Mein Rang Bare Baadin Bahar Chali, and Shah. So here we have as a source text all of these poems in them where the words appear as what can I say, and have been dealt by the translators in their own way. Like, say for example, in Mujhse Pehli Si Mohabbat Mere Mehboob Na Maan, the word appears in the source text as Hayat, which has been translated, in the target text first by Aga Shahid Ali as world, and by Shiv K. Kumar as being. Likewise, in the same poem, the word appears like Jagda, which has been appeared in TT1 as weep and in TT2 as counterpoise. We can carry on with the words here like dunya. In TT1 that appeared as sky, and in TT2 the translator have not found any of the suitable and convenient word to translate. So here he have not translated the word dunya into his translation. So likewise, I have the another poem from which I have taken out some words to describe the translation and the understanding of the both of the translators, that is Chirag, which appeared in the translation of Aga Shahid Ali as lamp, and in the translation of Shiv K. Kumar as tapers. And the same way, there we have another word, that is Rahguzar, has been translated by Aga Shahid Ali as roads, and in the target text too that appears as highways, and the word which appears as Minawe Ayat, which had been translated in target text 1 as glasses, and in the target text 2 as cups. So likewise, we have the another poem, that is Aaye Ho Shab Intizar.
Not based on gender.
Am I audible to everyone? Okay.
Yes, you are. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Aaye Ho Shab Intizar Guzri, where the words appear like Junoon, and where Aga Shahid Ali had translated the word as madness, and in the target text too, in Shiv K. Kumar's translation, the word appears as frenzy. Same we have the words like Shab, Bakar, Nasya, Sarpui, Chamin, Kafis, which have been translated like by both of the translators in target text 1 as Shab, evening, and in TT2 as night. And in the word like Bakar, which has been translated as useful, and in target text 2 as well spent. So there are the differences in both of the translators, while we understand the translation and the reconstitution of their, can I say, understanding of a language into other one. Likewise, we have here Gulo me rang bare badino bahar chale, where the words appear as kafas, which Aga Shahid Ali has translated as prison, and Shivki Kumar has, translated it as cage. And another word in the same poem appears as Yaro. Both of the translators have, translated it as friends. And where we have that Sabha, that both of the translators have, translated it as, breathe. But as we see what can I say, translation of Aga Shahid Ali here, Aga Shahid Ali here have not found any of the convenient word in English to translate the Sabha. What can I say, then he had left and had not translated the same word. Likewise, we have Sham here, in which, the words appear like balm. Balm has been translated as roof, and where Shivki Kumar has, written the same word in his translation as terrace. Then we have Parohit, but both of the translators have the same word translated it as priest here. Then we have Rakh, which actually have, can I say, both the translators have translated it as ashes. There are certain similarities in the words of both of the translators, like Mathe, which have been translated by both of the translators as forehead as well. So in this way, where we find the question of translatability, which is rendered here to constitute a language so as to frame out the words and structures into the selection of a new language. This makes a reconstitution of language as per the cultural and linguistic setup of selected text into a dominion of target text 1 and target text 2. The language transmission from one to another is not only culturally different, but linguistically varied as well, which makes a proper representation of words reconstituted by both the translators. In this case, the reconstitution of language have been done in a varied way by both of translators who reconstituted languages as per the sense of understanding by researching upon the words of the texts which carries as similar meaning in the other languages or target languages. The above mentioned display of carryover of language from text to text is a clear implementation of what we call the reconstitution of language through translation of the same text. Thereupon, we have some major concerns which we need to look upon here minutely. That is the comprehension of making a language into the other languages, which is providing a sense of unity and cultural and linguistic variation. And it's quite evident as some of the words appeared like hayat in the source text, and in the target text 1, the same word translated as world, and in the target text 2, the same word is translated as being. The question of reconstitution emerges here as per the critical appreciation of the translators who translates the same word differently to frame a new appearance of the word. Likewise, there are some examples where the presentation of words are same and has a flow together to form a new sense of understanding. But somewhere we also see from the above representation of the table that few words were not translated by the translator, as the suitability of the word doesn't appear apparently as other translators have done. In this instance, the example which we have, like the word alam appears in one of the poems, which is translated by both of the translators. Neither Aga Shahid Ali nor Shivki Kumar have found it any of the suitable word for the condition or to translate the word into an order to reconstitute a language. So at the same time, the word Jabaja is translated in TT1 again and again, but in TT2, the another translator hadn't found the suitability and a kind of translatability for the word to be translated upon in the target language. The presentation of such inter alia is an accumulation of idea of taking a language from one parameter to another parameter without changing the words, or sometimes without translating the word. These parameters are found in the cultural and linguistic scenario of languages, where the words of the text tussles to make it a form of another language. This is so because linguistically language varies in the sense of interpretation as well as in its implication. Further, enduring the process of translation, theorists, translators went beyond the linguistic issues like equivalence, loss and gain, linguistics and cultural untranslatability to the issues in translation. As far as the theory and reconstitution of language in translation is concerned, theorists have started thinking about the translator, awareness about the culture of the source text and target text, then only they can have an eligibility to be culturally conscious or bicultural in comprehension, so as to make out a proper interpretation of what we call the reconstitution of a text. At the time of translation, a translator must have a knowledge of a culture of the source culture as well as the target culture. It helps a translator to produce a better reconstitution. Moreover, it also helps a translator to overcome from the loss of meaning from the source text into the target text and to gain the appropriate meaning from the source text into the target text. Cultural theories of translation have helped the translators to redefine their strategies of translation. Various strategies like domestication and foreignization were deeply discussed by Lawrence Venuti. These strategies have clearly helped the translator to overcome the loss and gain of meaning during the process of translation, but it has also played a crucial role in the ideology and politics of the translation. This way, the reconstitution of translation, so the translation is made to make a new form of language without losing its cultural as well as its linguistic richness. The process of reconstitution is seen as a process of making a language into a new form with new dimension, but with the same carryover of meaning and essence of being what's written in the text and how it remakes to form a new one. Further, this process of reconstitution takes three practical aspects which a translator needed, which Aga Shahid Ali and Shiv K. Kumar have highlighted while analyzing the texts, which are as follows. One, to keep and analyze the nouns by dividing them into categories, to make proper selection of words from target text while reconstitution of language, to ensure the proper word-to-word translation without losing the basic effect of the source text into the target text. Same is also a case with both the translators and with the text where they have translated through the different categories, for instance, nouns and how they have been divided. The first category includes examples in which nouns have been translated into multiple ways by the select translators. This category is showing the variation in both the translation. The second category is discussing the nouns in which both the translators have provided the similar equivalent words in the target text. The third category is discussing the nouns which have been deleted and translated by the select translator. This is the way a proper reconstitution of a language is made through the translation of any of the source text into the target text, which constitutes all the parameters minutely to discuss the issue of what's being called a language, its culture and linguistic dimensions to carry out the proper sense of interpretation. As pointed out by the Susan Bennett and Lafayette, once upon a time, the question that were always being asked were how can translations be taught and how can translations be studied. Those who regarded themselves as translators were often contemptuous of any attempt to teach translation, whilst those who claimed to teach often did not translate and so had to resort the old evaluative method of setting one translation alongside another and examining both in a formalist vacuum. Now the questions have changed. The objective of both sources and targets are cultural signs, and in this way, translation studies have been able both to utilize and reconstitute the linguistic approach and to move out beyond it. So in my conclusion, the reconstitution of language through translation has displayed even a very crucial role in the proliferation of knowledge in various fields and disciplines. It is through translation and reconstitution of languages we are able to take a voyage across the world to understand culture and people. There is always a need to know about the other cultures, and translation, which is the only tool to communicate and exchange ideas. However, to produce the quality translation theory and reconstitution of language is must, which guides us the translator and reconstitutes the language properly without the fallout of any meaning. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Ahmed Bashir, for your interesting presentation on reconstitution of Faiz poetry, a case analysis of two different translators. One is Aga Shahid Ali and Shiv Kumar. So now the presentation looked into aspects of translatability and the idea of suitability and linguistic and cultural parameters which are important, and then talked about the multiplicity in which one engages in the task of translation. So it was a very interesting presentation again, and now all the four papers are open for questions and debates and things like that. So now we have about I think 10 to 20, 15 minutes for question and answer session. The floor is open for questions. I request all speakers to switch on their cameras so that your presence is felt. And questions, if at all, please, just to kind of provoke the audience. They have talked about several issues concerning very interesting aspects, basically with regard to literary translation and translation from below, and how plurality and the Indian literatures are very, very important when we come to terms with translation. That was what Asit was trying to suggest. And you also try to highlight otherness and difference as central ingredients when one looks into the aspect of translation. So one would like to look into this aspect and ask questions. Ajay was talking about a whole lot of things, talking about multiple translations and then trying to look at difference in translation. And he was actually trying to ask a question, why do multiple translations happen? And he had his own analysis for that. And he also discussed very interestingly about aging translations, which was very, very interesting and very, very illuminating. So Nimish K. Sharma talked about Ghazal translations and then talked about very interesting aspects and very interesting ideas concerning Ghazal translation, basically meaning creation and theme creation. What he called, the terms that he used for that, Mani Afrini and Mazmoon Afrini. So that was very interesting, and he elaborately discussed this particular aspect and talked about at length how multiple translations come into the picture and how a comparative analysis helps us a great deal in that particular aspect in that event. Then we have Amir Bashir talking about reconstitution, translation as an activity of reconstitution itself, and trying to see how two different translators in a very interesting way reconstitute the source text, and in the context of Faiz's poetry. And he elaborately talked about suitability of certain terms and certain kinds of ideas and linguistic and cultural parameters. So it was illuminating, very entertaining as well, intellectually entertaining and interesting. So I'm now, I request audience to please go ahead and come out with certain questions to the speakers. I have a question for Ajay. Why would you call it comparative translation? You could have simply confined yourself to talk about multiple translations. When you use the term comparative, certain things are implied. For me, nothing becomes comparative unless there is a method of inquiry. So people will simply say comparative all the time, and we compare literatures, but then there is a way to do that. There is a kind of a method to do that, and that is really very important. And I didn't see that particular aspect with respect to the kind of multiple translations that we were discussing. Why were you trying to talk about comparative translations? Was there? It could have been enough to simply say multiple translation. How do you answer that?
So thank you for, first of all, thank you for your question.
Ajay, I have a related question. If the chair permits, I can.
Yeah, please.
Amir,
yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
See, you started with multiple source text and the problem of translation, because you had, for you, those translations were not translation, is it? Because you were trying to translate that into Kannada. So you had multiple source text.
Yeah, multiple secondary
and
sources.
Then you are translating, then you moved on to multiple sources. No, for you they are primary. From the point of view of chronology, they are secondary, because there is something else before that. But for you, they are the primary text through which you are trying to translate.
Yes.
And it is not something new. Even when O.L. Nabushan Swami translated War and Peace into Kannada, he had 4 English translations in front of him. And he discusses that in his introduction too. And even in pre-colonial India too, when Nannaya was translating Mahabharata into Telugu, it is said that he knew the existence of Kannada text. So we don't know whether he was translating from Kannada, whether he was translating from Sanskrit directly, whether he also had some idea about Padma Puranas in Jaina tradition in Prakrit. So Pavumacharyu. So having multiple texts itself is something new. We have not discussed that much in the translation studies. But from that multiple source text, you usually moved into multiple translation and retranslation, and you went on about it. But again, how do you look at the multiple translations, retranslation? Yes, comparison is a method, not only for multiple translation, retranslation, even to look at any translation, to assess any translation, you employ a comparative method of source text and the target text. So the question is, so you started with the multiple source text. That was an interesting aspect. Then you moved on to the multiple translation, retranslations. But you are talking about comparative translation.
Yeah, sir, I completely understood your question. So I began my discussion with the collage translation, the concept of collage translation having multiple source text. Sir, that is possible. I mean, that type of translation is possible only when I don't know the source language. Then I don't know that which translation is close to the source text. In that cases, maybe I think I can consider all the translations and to create the best poetic effect out of all the translations. But I suddenly moved to multiple translations because most of the translation theories, I mean, they work on direct translations. In direct translations, you study different direct translations of a particular text. So I think only translation scholars are bothered much about this question of comparing the multiple translations than any other readers. Any other readers, they just go with the popular one that is available in the market. I mean, any popular translation, but I think they don't bother about comparing different translations. So in comparative translation, what I think is, generally in translation studies, the comparison starts basically with comparing the source, the translation with the source. So comparative translation also involves this aspect of comparing the translation with the source, along with, more interestingly, it should compare the different translations available only to know how processes vary from person to person and how the actual process of the typical process of translation is much betterly understood in comparative translation rather than in translation studies in merely comparing the source and original.
Well, again, I think you've also become very prescriptive in your work because you compare translations and then you come to the thing that this is going to be a better way of translating in the case of Alejandro. So I was wondering, what is the purpose then? If you are trying to compare and come to a conclusion that this is the best version of trying to do that, then what about the multiplicity which is existing? Are you trying to question the multiplicity that is existing and the value of it?
No,
you're undermining the existing translations?
No. So definitely, that's what I have told in my collage translation. The concept of collage translation, of course, it has limitations because it distances the translator from the fidelity. Because translator is neither is faithful to the original, not strictly to any translation available. Because that's what the collage translation. The fidelity is in a collective way to all the translations. And of course, there are limitations. But what I thought is that is the best possible way. That's what I have used the metaphor. These are different shades of the same color. It's very difficult to pick one shade out of them. So what I done is I combined all the shades to make it a new one, which I thought of calling it as a color again.
I have a question, but after Ipshita.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. Ipshita, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lakshmi, also for allowing me to ask before you. But I wonder what you mean by a better translation. A is a better translation than B.
No, yeah. I'm not at all judging here. Which is the better one. I'm not.
Also, this is new and therefore it is better. That is what it sounds like.
No, that is argued by, no, ma'am, that is argued by Berman, French translation scholar called Berman. He argues that the new translation will always be in a better way than the previous ones. I argued that it is not true. It is not true because it also, yeah.
No, carry on. I just want to carry on with Berman for a moment also. Just finish
what Berman has told is translation is always an incomplete act. When the new translation comes, then the act of translation gets completed. Then what he says is, yeah. Are you asking something again?
No, you finish.
Yeah, ma'am. What is
think about what you're saying.
The new translations keep on completing the process of translation is what he is arguing. So he is telling that new translation is always the better one than the older one. But I do not agree with that one because it also depends on the intellectuality of the translator. It also depends on whether the translators are archiving the text or not. It also depends on whether they are contemporarizing it, whether there is a necessary to contemporize the work. These all questions come in. So you can't sweepingly say that the new translations are always better, and you can't again say that indirect translations is not at all better than the direct translations. I can quote enough examples from Telugu literature, Telugu translations, where indirect translations are much better than direct translations in some ways.
Yeah, I think Amit has the same thing to say as I do. So yeah,
because there are entire retranslation. Yeah. Please.
Sorry. What Ipshita is trying to do is she's trying to ask whether there is something called a better translation at all.
And whether there is something called a complete translation or an incomplete one.
No.
Whether it is Varma or anyone else.
Yeah, what I feel is, since I'm also a translator, what I feel is, every translator will try to approach the text in his own way. You can't rightly say that, you can't sweepingly say that this is the better one, this is the poor one, this is the bad one. You can't say like that. Because the approaches in translating the work are different. When they are different, you can't outrightly say that this is better than this. So I don't I don't bother about this question in my paper.
Ipshita, I think
you are muted.
You have to unmute.
No, I don't think that was anything worth. You consider it with a great deal of importance. Huh? The whole idea of a multiple translation, I think, starts from there, doesn't it?
What?
I think it's an acceptable idea. There is more than one reading of a text. There is more than one translation of a text. And whether it is done immediately or 500 years later, it's a translation. I don't know where the issue or the point is. I was unable to understand that.
Okay, thank you, Ipshita. And Professor Lakshmi.
Yeah, I think Ipshita has asked that question. I found it very interesting, the Ajay's presentation. Some of the new things, these are really new to us, skeletal translation and collage translation and comparative translation, looking at multiple translations of the same text into the same language. Really, really very interesting to us. And as Ipshita was saying towards the end, so multiple interpretations result in multiple translations of the same text, whether they are direct or indirect. Even in indirect translation, if you take one translation as your source text, okay, this is as good as a direct translation. In your case, you looked at 4 different translations in the same language and came up with one single translation, picking up something from this, from that, and you call it a skeletal translation or a collage translation. This is something really new. But I think one thing that needs to be highlighted is when you are looking at the multiple translations, when you presented the reasons for the multiple translations, you listed quite a few things, and 1 or 2 things I would like to point out. One is the scopus, the purpose for which somebody is, the translator is translating. Why a translation is made, a new translation, or you attempt a new translation when you know already that there are 5-6 translations, you are attempting a new translation. What is your specific purpose? And also sometimes you are guided by your readers, for particular readers keeping in mind the interest of a particular section of your readers, you go for a particular version of the translation, or particular interpretation, or particular style of writing, etc. And also translation norms. Okay, translation norms that exist at the point of time, like 2010 to 2022, you have shown that maybe the translations norms would have changed. Maybe at one point in time it was translation should read like a translation, very little translation, a foreignized translation. At another point it may be, if you take the case of Telugu, it's only free writing or new writing. Translations are never read as translations. That is another thing. And one more point, like you have to pay attention to the agency, the mediators involved. Who are these people? For most of the differences, when you look at multiple translations, compare them one with the other and with the translation, you have to pay attention to the translator. Who is doing it? The mediator, the agency, that becomes important. Many questions, whatever the differences are in style or interpretations, the way they select their diction, words, vocabulary, etc., the answers come from the translator, who the translator is. See, recently I looked at Kanya Sulkam, translated by our Velcher Narayan.
Yeah, I have read your paper. It was
Vijayashri, and these people sitting at two different locations, translating from
ecology
different
of
audience,
translation.
published by different publishers, one in India, one in the USA. So that answers many of the differences that you find between the two translations. So similarly, you could have paid more attention to the agency involved, the mediators.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, ma'am.
So,
can I answer now?
That's all I wanted to say.
Ma'am, can I answer? Shall I answer now?
Yes, yes,
Very
yes.
shortly. Yeah, ma'am. This ecology of the translation, the background of the translator, actually, I am discussing in detail in my dissertation. This paper is actually my first chapter in the dissertation. In my second chapter, I have picked 5 translations of Kanya Sulkam. Out of them, I am comparing 2 translations. So, in that second chapter, I'm speaking in detail about these. I have picked one novel, play, short story, and poetry in all the comparing all the translations of 4 different genres. I'm doing it, ma'am. Thank you, and thank you for your suggestions.
Thank you very much, Professor Lakshmi. Now let me just move on to the other paper presenters. There are 3 more paper presenters. Any questions to the other paper presenters? There were 2 papers on Perso-Arabic poetics. I'm sure it must have generated some kind of an interest. Any questions on that to Dr. Amir and Dr. Nimish, and also to Asit? Okay, how do you distinguish, Nimish, between, say, for example, meaning creation and theme creation? Isn't meaning the same as theme? How is it that they are 2 different things? Because I was trying to wonder, how is that meaning something becomes totally different from the idea of theme? Meaning constitutes theme. If I were to say that, is that correct idea, or is there a kind of a gulf between meaning and theme? And how does Perso-Arabic poetics looks into this particular? You are very interestingly, I have noted down the concept Mazmoon Afrini and Ma'in Afrini. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but that's what they are. And how do you distinguish between these 2? Yeah.
Yes, sir. So this is actually not a Perso-Arabic tradition part at all. It is an Indian.
Okay.
It is an Indian intervention into the theory that has been extant till then, and it was an intervention done in the Sabke Hindi Persian verse, which is like biggest practitioners were poets like Bedil. So this distinction between Mani and Mazmoon, so how it happens is like the theme within, say, a ghazal. So if I restrict to ghazal, a theme is something that allows multiple meanings to come forth. And there are other poets who will argue that a very strong meaning that comes out of a theme creates a theme itself, which can be called Mazmoon Afrini. So the distinction that they make is what a poem is about and what it can mean comes from the assumption that there is no one meaning. So when they assume that there can be many meanings, so the meaning can emerge. There is not, I won't call it that meaning is a subtext of theme, but meanings can emerge from use of a theme, because when you read ghazals, so for example, there are highly
Can you give an example to understand what is meaning and what is theme in the context of the concepts that you were discussing?
Okay. So we saw a particular share like why दीवानगी है शौक की हरदम मुझको आप जाना उधर और आप ही हैरान होना. So what theme in this context would be, there is a lover, right? Or there is at least someone who is passionate about something, who has shock for something, like who is in divangi a shock. So this person goes somewhere and comes back perplexed. So this ardor, the shock, and the condition of the shock is the theme. And the meanings that are created from this share, which produces multiple interpretations, possibly because of the ambiguity of the situation itself. Where are we going? Why are we perplexed? हैरानी क्यों हुई? Like why are we perplexed? What do we see there? What place are we going to? So these possibilities that are left open are possibilities of meaning, and the overarching what the share is about basically is the theme. Now within this theme, if say someone works on this theme and like brings forth say a cypress tree there, and someone is going to the cypress tree. Cypress tree was a very important theme in the Perso-Arabic tradition, and like someone is going to the tree and the tree becomes a signifier of something else, and then there is a creation of a different theme from there, and then the mani that can be there, it can be also here, and like the interplay between the mani can establish itself again. So like roughly this is how I call it.
Can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
This is Satyendra from IWL department. Yeah, there is a share by Ghalib. He said, "Gazina mani ka tilas usko samajhiye, jo labz Ghalib mere ashar mein aave." So here he says about the mani that there is a like he has a treasure of meanings in his poems. So you have to just exhume those body what he says. You have to exhume those manis. So it can be my and it has a different connotation, different it has a different context when you talk about when you go for the money. And for the when you talk about the themes, Faiz has written a very beautiful poetry called Mawzu-e-Sukhan, when he talks about like what should be theme of the poetry. I'm working on Faiz, by the way. So so when he talks about the themes there, because themes on and all the meanings depends upon the context and the readers also. So that's what he actually mean to say that. I mean,
thank you for the additions. Thank you.
And I have one question for Asit. Asid, I really liked your presentation. I just wanted to add a share.
Thank you.
I reminded one of us, sure, we had a good conversation during EFLU. So there is a share by Firaq Gorakhpuri where he says, when you talked about linguistic plurality, he talked about India as a linguistic plural multiple culture. He says, "Sar zameen Hind pe aqwam alam ke firaq, sar zameen Hind pe aqwam alam ke firaq, काफिले बसते गए हिंदुस्तान बनता गया." So what he means that there were a lot of people, there were a lot of tribes who came India and made the India. That's what we call linguistic. I mean, within one share we can judge all over it, and we can say all the meaning of and the linguistic plurality. And there is one more when you I think you mentioned about Kuwar Narayan, Hindi poet, about the linguist. There is also linguistic dilemma, which I think it is written by. There is a poem called Desh Aur Ghar, which is written by Kedar Nath Singh. He was actually a Bhojpuri poet, essentially a Bhojpuri poet. He wrote in Hindi. So he read about कि हिंदी मेरा देश है, भोजपुरी मेरा घर है. देश से निकलता हूँ तो घर में चला आता हूँ, और घर से निकलता हूँ तो देश में चला आता हूँ. इस आवाजाही में कई बार देश घर में छूट जाता है और कई बार घर में मैं देश ले आता हूँ. और देखिए ना मेरी मुश्किल, पिछले 60 बरस से मैं दोनों को दोनों में खोज रहा हूँ. So he's neither for Hindi nor for Bhojpuri, he says. And now it's kind of dilemma. Like,
thank you very much for your recitation. It was indeed very beautiful. Yeah. If we have questions or comments, please.
I mean, there are 2 comments in YouTube that have been posted here in the chat box.
Can somebody read it out for me, because I'm a little I find it difficult to
Yes, sir. Sure.
Somebody, yeah, please can you direct it to the speaker also?
Yeah. So the first question is: are the texts complete in the first place? Are
Yeah, that's
texts
what
complete in the first place?
Yeah.
It is by Kavita Patil on YouTube.
Yeah. So this is, I believe, a question for the general panel. Is there a question? I would direct it to Amir Bashir. Can you please answer this question? Whether is there anything called a complete text in the first place, and what happens to the complete, so-called complete text after translation? Will that become incomplete?
Thank
Amir?
you. Yes, I have listened you. So thank you so much for your question. Actually, so far as my understanding of the translations are concerned, I have not only gone through the translations of Aga Shahid Ali and Shivki Kumar, but there is Professor Baron Faruqi from Jamia Millia Islamia University, who have also translated the same text of Faiz Ahmed Faiz from Urdu to English. But what we can say, so far as the translations are concerned, I think personally, we never came up to the conclusion that there is any example for the complete text. That even if I will happen to translate the same text right now, I will translate it in a very different way. And so for the readers, it would be then a very different experience if they have gone through the earlier translation of any other translator. So for me, that there would not be in any of the example in translation that there can be any of the translation which we call a complete text.
Okay, thank you for your views. Any other views by the speakers?
Another question, sir. What exactly is a collage translation? Can we have an example, please?
This is, I'm sure it is for Ajay. Where is Ajay?
Yeah.
Yeah, briefly, Ajay, you have talked about it very briefly.
Yeah. Collage translation is what I have told. Collage translation happens when you don't know the source language. When you don't know the source language, but you have given with many different, multiple translations from the source language, then you can't really guess which is the best translation in the secondary source. Then you go with what I called as collage translation. Collage translation means taking different words, phrases, lines from all the available translations and best fitting it to give the more poetical sense out of the available version. So I haven't come across any collage translations so far. Give it as an example, but I have done collage translations into Canada, which I have depicted in the PPT that was published also in 2018. Am I clear to you?
Yeah. Thank you for your reply. I think more or less we have covered all the aspects. We have given enough time to the speakers to answer the questions, and all of them have responded to the questions. So shall we conclude? The organizers,
Yes,
with your permission? Yeah.
Yes, sir, we'll conclude.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation about the kind of interconnectedness that seems to be existing between comparative literature and translation studies. And the panel was had presentations with respect to comparative literature on the one hand, and also on translation studies, and the way in which there seems to be a bridge between comparative literature and translation studies. And all the paper presenters were talking about translation studies, of course, translation, but at the same time they were referring to comparative literary studies in some way. It was indeed very illuminating, and to say the least, in a very formal way. It was interesting, thought-provoking, and very, very helpful. But what is very important for us to also notice is that either of these disciplines, comparative literature or translation studies, are not dependent upon each other. They have their own interesting array of stuff that they can deal with. And even if they don't have to depend upon each other, they are independent disciplines in their own right, and they can forge ahead and march ahead in this and try to. They have enough things to deal with. In fact, in comparative literature, it is we often say to read is to compare. To read is to compare. I go by the traditional kind of idea given by George Steiner, who says that to read is to compare. So the very fact that you are reading automatically you start evolving methods of comparison. So that is one thing which the papers also brought out, and they were interestingly talking about very important aspects concerning literary translation, literary comparative translation, ghazal translation, and the questions of translatability in five, reconstitution, translation as reconstitution, etc., etc. There were different dynamics that they were trying to focus on, and they were very interesting presentations. I thank the panel members. All of them deserve a good round of applause for your wonderful presentations. And I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to chair this session. It was indeed wonderful. With that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you all the presenters for their wonderful presentations. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Amit Kumar for chairing the session and leading an active discussion. Thank you very much, sir. I thank all the presenters, sir, and participants for attending this session. We'll break for lunch now. The next session will start around